Imagine a war is over. Cities are in ruins, millions of people are dead, entire families have been wiped out, and the world is faced with a question that has never been seen before. Can those responsible for an entire terrorist state really be brought to justice? That's exactly what this video is about. We talk about the Nuremberg Trials, about the men at the head of the National Socialist regime, about guilt, responsibility, power, and the question of whether justice can even be possible after such a crime. Before we begin, please write me in the comments. Do you believe that the Nuremberg trials were real justice, or were they above all a judgment of the victors over the vanquished? I am very interested in your opinion, because this topic is not only history to this day, but also touches on questions that also affect our present. Who is responsible for war? When does obedience become guilt? And is a state ever allowed to hide behind orders, ideology, or power interests? If you are interested in historical topics, major questions of power, and the dark turning points of world history, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more videos about war, politics, responsibility, and the decisions that have shaped our history. And with that, we begin with one of the most important trials in modern history, the Nuremberg Trials. Chapter 1. Europe after the war. When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the continent was hardly recognizable. The Second World War had not only defeated armies, shifted borders, and overthrown governments. It had shaken entire societies, wiped out cities, torn families apart, and thrown millions of people into a future marked by hunger, loss, and insecurity. After 6 years of war, Europe was not a place of victory, not even for those who had won militarily. It was a space of ruins, mass graves, abandoned streets, destroyed train stations, burned out houses, and people who didn't know where to go. Anyone who walked through Berlin, Warsaw, Dresden, Rotterdam, Budapest, or Cologne did not only see broken buildings. One saw the collapse of an entire order. In Germany, the collapse was particularly visible. The country, which had unleashed a war of annihilation under National Socialist leadership, now lay occupied by itself, smashed and morally exposed. The major cities were severely damaged by bombing, transport routes were destroyed, factories were at a standstill, administrations functioned only to a limited extent. Many people lived in basements, emergency shelters, or half-destroyed apartments. Food was scarce, there was a lack of fuel, diseases spread, and soldiers, refugees, former forced laborers, prisoners of war, widows, orphans, and returnees moved side by side on the streets. Each carried a different story, but almost all of them were marked by fear, exhaustion, and loss. At the same time, the end of the war marked the beginning of a phase in which the truth about the National Socialist crimes became visible to an extent that shocked even many experienced soldiers, journalists, and politicians. The liberation of the concentration camps and extermination camps had produced images that burned themselves deeply into the consciousness of the world. In Buchenwald, Bergen, Belsen, Dachau, Mauthausen, and other camps, Allied soldiers found emaciated survivors, mountains of corpses, traces of torture, hunger, epidemics, and organized dehumanization. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec stood for an even more radical reality: the industrial murder of millions of people, especially European Jews, but also Sinti and Roma, political opponents, Soviet prisoners of war, people with disabilities, and many others who had been persecuted and deprived of their rights by the Nazi state. These discoveries fundamentally changed the mood after the war. It was no longer just a matter of managing a defeated enemy. It was about the question of how a world community should react to crimes that had not been committed as individual acts of violence, but as a state-planned and administered system. The National Socialist regime had not only waged war. It had put law, administration, police, military, business, science, and propaganda at the service of a murderous ideology. This gave rise to a problem that reached far beyond Germany. Could such crimes be recorded at all with the previous means of the law? Many people demanded quick punishment. For survivors, relatives of the victims, and many Allied soldiers, it was difficult to bear that leading National Socialists should still be given the opportunity to speak out in court. The crimes seemed so obvious, so enormous and so inhumane that a long trial seemed to some like an unnecessary delay. Others, on the other hand, were convinced that it was precisely the size of the guilt that made due process necessary. Not out of leniency towards the perpetrators, but because the world should see what had happened. A trial could collect evidence, reveal responsibilities, and counter the lie that could later claim that everything was exaggerated, fabricated, or just the work of a few. In this tension, the idea arose to bring the most important representatives of the Nazi regime before an international court. That was historically new. Although there had been calls for political and military leaders to be held responsible for their actions after previous wars, it was mostly states that were punished, not individual decision-makers. After 1945, this was to change. It was no longer only Germany as a state that was to be responsible for war and crime. Individual men who had given orders, created laws, organized deportations, planned wars of aggression, facilitated mass murders, or supported the system politically were to be held personally accountable. This idea was revolutionary, but also controversial, because it posed fundamental questions to the law. Was it permissible to convict people for actions that were perhaps covered by laws, orders, or state structures under national law at the time? Could a minister, a general, a lawyer, or an administrator say that he was only doing his duty? Where did obedience end, and where did personal guilt begin? Was a war of aggression a crime for which politicians and military leaders could be held personally responsible? And could there be crimes that weighed so heavily that no state in the world was allowed to justify them by its own laws? Europe after the war was therefore not only a continent of ruins, but also a continent of questions. People were looking for relatives, food, safety, and an explanation for how such a disaster had been possible. In Germany, many met their own past with silence, defensiveness, or self-pity. Some saw themselves primarily as victims of bombing, flight, and occupation. Others knew very well what had happened, but did not want to talk about it. Still others had benefited, participated, looked the other way, or adapted. The Nuremberg Trials would later shine a light precisely on this repressed reality. They made it clear that the Nazi system had not only consisted of Hitler and a few fanatical followers, but of a network of institutions, interests, careers, and decisions. The situation was also complicated for the Allies. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had fought together against Hitler's Germany, but their political goals were by no means identical. The war had hardly ended when new tensions were already emerging. The Soviet Union wanted to secure itself from a renewed German attack and at the same time expand its influence in Eastern Europe. The Western Allies wanted to control Germany, but also to create a stable order in the long term that would not plunge Europe into permanent chaos. A common line had to be found between these interests. The punishment of the Nazi leadership was a point on which agreement could be reached, but even here the ideas about procedures, evidence, punishments, and political effects differed. Nuremberg became the place where these different levels converged. The city was not chosen at random. It was closely linked to the self-staging of National Socialism. The Nazi party rallies had taken place here. Mass marches, flags, speeches, and rituals had been staged here, with which the regime wanted to feign strength, unity, and historical greatness. This is precisely why Nuremberg had a special symbolic power. In the place where the regime had celebrated its power, his guilt was now to be tried. The city itself was badly damaged, but the Palace of Justice still offered the conditions for a major trial. In this way, practical necessity was combined with historical symbolism. For many observers, the trial was more than a legal event from the beginning. It was an attempt to draw a line. Not everything a state does should be dismissed as an internal affair in the future. Not every command should excuse. Not every uniform should protect. Not all political power should be above the law. This basic idea was simple and at the same time tremendously demanding. The powerful should also bear responsibility. Especially those who start wars, deprive peoples of their rights, deport people, organize mass murder, and use violence as a means of rule should not be able to hide behind office, rank, or state. But the way there was difficult. The evidence had to be reviewed, documents translated, witnesses found, and charges formulated. Many perpetrators were dead, fled, or tried to conceal their role. Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels were no longer alive. Others, such as Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, or Rosenberg, were imprisoned by the Allies. They would stand trial, not as representatives of a defeated state, but as persons who were ascribed concrete responsibility. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in legal history. Europe after the war was therefore more than the backdrop for the Nuremberg Trials. It was the prerequisite for its creation. Without the ruins, without the camps, without the millions of dead, without the experience of an unleashed war of annihilation, this court would not have existed. The trials were a response to a world that had seen where ideology, racial fanaticism, militarism, and totalitarian power could lead. They were an attempt to learn a lesson from the catastrophe, even if this lesson was imperfect, politically charged, and humanly difficult to bear. In the beginning, therefore, there was no simple certainty, but a harrowing question. How do you create justice after a crime so great that it exceeds any idea of normal guilt? Nuremberg was born precisely from this question. And that is precisely why the Nuremberg trials are still more than a historical event today. They are a touchstone for whether law can be stronger than violence, whether memory can be stronger than repression, and whether humanity finds the courage to call a spade after the darkest moments in its history. Chapter 2. The Fall of the Third Reich. The downfall of the Third Reich did not begin in the last days of April 1945, when Adolf Hitler was locked in the bunker under the Reich Chancellery and gave orders for armies that hardly existed anymore over a crumbling map. It had been announced long before, in the lost battles, in the destroyed cities, in the endless columns of wounded soldiers and refugees, in the collapsing fronts in the east and west. But in the spring of 1945, the slow decay turned into an open catastrophe. The regime, which had once spoken of world domination, race war, and a 1,000-year Reich, fought only for hours, streets, and illusions. The military defeat was obvious, but the political leadership refused to acknowledge reality. At that time, Germany was under pressure from all sides. In the West, American, British, Canadian, and French troops had crossed the Rhine and were advancing deep into the territory of the Reich. In the East, the Red Army stood on the Oder after a huge offensive and prepared the attack on Berlin. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, bled dry in personnel, and materially inferior. There was a shortage of fuel, ammunition became scarce, tanks and planes could hardly be replaced. Entire formations consisted of poorly educated youths, older men, motley remnants of smashed units, and soldiers who had long since broken inwardly after years of war. Nevertheless, the leadership continued to demand perseverance, sacrifice, and blind obedience. National Socialism had not mitigated in its last months, but had become radicalized. The closer defeat came, the more brutal the regime became against its own population, against forced laborers, prisoners, deserters, and all those who were considered traitors. Courts-martial imposed death sentences. People were hanged for alleged cowardice. White flags could be deadly. In many places, shortly before the invasion of Allied troops, the party had men, women, and young people intimidated or murdered if they openly expressed the senselessness of the fight. The war was not ended because the leadership wanted to protect the lives of the population. It continued until complete destruction, because the regime did not want to separate its own downfall from the fate of Germany. The situation in the East was particularly dramatic. Millions of German civilians fled from the Red Army from East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and other areas. Many were afraid of revenge, violence, and expulsion, and this fear was not unfounded. At the same time, it must not be forgotten that this catastrophe took place in a space that National Socialist Germany itself had previously covered with tremendous violence. From the beginning, the war in the East had been waged as a war of annihilation and conquest. Cities had been destroyed, villages burned, Jews murdered, prisoners of war starved to death, and civilians killed en masse. As the front rolled back to the West, violence returned to the country that had unleashed it. For many people, the spring of 1945 therefore meant not only military defeat, but flight, panic, and the final collapse of all security. Berlin became the last scene of this self-destruction. The capital of the empire was badly damaged by air raids. The supply situation was catastrophic, and yet it was declared a fortress. Hitler stayed in the Führerbunker, a closed underground room that increasingly became a symbol of escapism. While houses burned outside, grenades fell and civilians sought shelter in basements. The remaining leadership discussed loyalty, betrayal, and phantom armies. Hitler blamed the defeat on generals, the German people, and alleged traitors, but not on his own policies. He was not prepared to take responsibility. For him, the downfall of Germany was more acceptable than the admission that his worldview, his warfare, and his rule had led to catastrophe. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life. With him, not only the dictator died, but also the central figure on whom the entire National Socialist power structure had been oriented. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister and one of Hitler's most fanatical supporters, also committed suicide shortly afterwards after having his children killed. Heinrich Himmler tried to offer himself to the Allies, but was arrested and later evaded responsibility by committing suicide. Many other leading National Socialists fled, went into hiding, took off their uniforms, or tried to downplay their role. The fall of the empire was therefore also a moment of flight from guilt. The men, who had preached obedience, sacrifice, and harshness for years, were now looking for ways to save themselves. After Hitler's death, power formally passed to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had designated as Reich president in his political will. Dönitz formed a last imperial government in Flensburg, which, however, was little more than a transitional administration under the eyes of the Allies. Their goal was no longer victory, but the most favorable surrender possible, especially to the Western powers. Dönitz hoped to allow as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from the east to the west, so that they would not be taken prisoner by the Soviets. This intention corresponded to a real fear of many Germans, but at the same time it was politically transparent. The new leadership wanted to end the war in the West more quickly, but to continue fighting in the East for as long as possible. The Allies did not agree to this. They insisted on an unconditional surrender to all victorious powers. The unconditional surrender was a decisive point. It meant that Germany could not impose any political conditions. After the experiences of the First World War, the Allies wanted to prevent the claim that Germany had not really been defeated from arising again later. The so-called stab-in-the-back legend poisoned the Weimar Republic after 1918 and helped the National Socialists to portray the defeat as a betrayal instead of a military reality. In 1945, there was to be no room for a similar legend. Germany was completely defeated militarily, its cities were occupied, its government no longer had any power, its armies capitulated. On May 7, 1945, the military surrender was signed in Reims, which came into force on May 8. At Soviet insistence, the signing was repeated on the night of May 9 in Berlin-Karlshorst, as the Soviet Union demanded a capitulation in the center of the defeated Reich and with its visible participation. For Western Europe, May 8 became the day of liberation and the end of the war, while in the Soviet Union, May 9 was celebrated as Victory Day. These different dates already show that although the end of the war was a joint victory over Hitler's Germany, it was remembered and interpreted politically differently by the victorious powers. The capitulation ended the National Socialist rule, but not its effect. The institutions of the empire had collapsed, but the traces of his crimes were everywhere exposed. In the camps, liberated prisoners lived between life and death. In Europe, millions of people were looking for relatives. In Germany, party functionaries were arrested, administrations were audited, soldiers were disarmed, files were secured, and those responsible were sought. The Allies were faced with the enormous task of controlling a defeated country, ensuring supplies, initiating denazification, and at the same time finding those who were responsible for war, terror, and mass murder. The fall of the Third Reich was therefore not only a military event. It was a moral and political collapse. The National Socialist leadership had led Germany into a war that they understood as a struggle for living space, race, and power. It had violently overtaken Europe, destroyed states, deprived peoples of their rights, and murdered millions of people. When this system collapsed, it left behind not only rubble, but also the question of guilt. Who had planned, who had ordered, who had organized, who had profited, who had participated? These questions could not be answered by capitulation alone. They demanded investigation, evidence, and verdicts. Precisely because Hitler himself was dead, this question became even more important. The dictator could no longer be brought to justice. Himmler and Goebbels also evaded responsibility. But the National Socialist system did not consist of just one person. It had needed ministers, generals, lawyers, diplomats, police leaders, business leaders, propagandists, and administrative officials. Without them, the rule would not have worked. Without them, war of aggression, occupation policy, deportations, and mass murder would not have been possible to this extent. Hitler's death should therefore not mean that the guilt disappeared with him. The military end of the Reich thus resulted in the path to Nuremberg. The Allies had to decide how to deal with the living leaders. A mere reckoning through shootings might have fulfilled the desire for quick retribution, but it would not have made the structure of the crimes visible. A trial was able to show that the catastrophe had not arisen by chance, but from decisions, ideology, striving for power, and bureaucratic planning. He was able to explain how political radicalization turned into a world war and how industrial mass murder could arise from state administration. The fall of the Third Reich was thus the immediate antechamber of the Nuremberg Trials. Only when the guns fell silent could the extent of the crimes be fully investigated. Only when the leadership was captured, dead or escaped, did the question of personal responsibility arise with full sharpness. And it was only when Germany had surrendered unconditionally that the Allies were able to create a court that would judge men who had decided on the life and death of millions just a few months earlier. The path from Berlin to Nuremberg was therefore not an easy transition from war to peace. It was an attempt to create a new form of law out of the collapse of a criminal power. Chapter 3. Why Nuremberg? The choice of Nuremberg as the venue for the trial of the leading men of the National Socialist regime was never just a practical decision. It was charged with significance from the very beginning, because hardly any other German city was as closely associated with the self-staging of National Socialism as Nuremberg. This was where the Nazi party rallies had taken place, those huge mass events at which Adolf Hitler, the NSDAP, and their organizations wanted to create an image of unity, power, and historical greatness. In the regime's propaganda, Nuremberg was not simply a city, but a stage. In their squares and in their marching areas, National Socialism had presented itself as a movement that supposedly united the past, present, and future of Germany. The fact that the leading representatives of this system later stood trial here of all places gave the trial a symbolic power that went far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Nuremberg had a special historical significance even before the Nazi era. The city stood for medieval imperial tradition, for trade, crafts, urban self-confidence, and a long connection to the history of the Holy Roman Empire. The National Socialists deliberately took up this past because they liked to present themselves as heirs to a supposedly great German history. They loved places, images, and rituals that suggested depth and fate. Nuremberg offered them exactly this backdrop. Old walls, towers, squares, and the name of a traditional imperial city could be incorporated into the political imagery of the regime. This created an artificial connection between the medieval idea of the empire and modern dictatorship, between historical memory and totalitarian propaganda. The Nazi party rallies of the NSDAP were particularly important. They took place in Nuremberg as huge political stagings and served to mobilize supporters, intimidate opponents, and show the world an image of discipline and strength. Hundreds of thousands of people marched, flags were carried, spotlights lit up the night sky, speeches were made, music and architecture worked together. Nothing about it was accidental. The regime wanted to create feelings, not discussions. It wanted to let the individual merge into the crowd and convey to him that he was part of a historical mission. It was precisely this mixture of aesthetics, power, and submission that made Nuremberg a core place of National Socialist self-expression. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 also strengthened the city's importance. At a Nazi party rally, the racist laws were promulgated that deprived Jewish Germans of their rights and legally enshrined their exclusion from society. These laws were a decisive step on the path from discrimination to systematic persecution. They made it clear that the regime's anti-Semitism did not only consist of violence on the streets or propaganda in newspapers, but was cast in legal form. In Nuremberg, the Nazi state had publicly and demonstratively declared its racist ideology to be right. Later, when crimes against humanity were tried in the same city, it created a bitter historical reversal. The place where injustice had once been celebrated as law now became the place where this injustice was brought to justice. But the decision in favor of Nuremberg was not based solely on symbolism. After the war, Germany lay in ruins, and an international procedure of this magnitude posed enormous practical challenges. A suitable courthouse was needed, rooms for judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, interpreters, journalists, guards, and defendants. You needed safe detention facilities, functioning infrastructure, and a situation that could be controlled by the Allies. In many German cities, courts, administrative buildings, and traffic routes were severely destroyed. Nuremberg was also badly damaged, but the Palace of Justice had survived the war comparatively well. Above all, it had a large jury courtroom and was directly connected to a prison. This connection was of great importance because the defendants could be brought safely between detention and trial without the need for long transports. The Palace of Justice therefore became the center of the proceedings. The hall had to be rebuilt to meet the special requirements of the International Military Tribunal. It was not an ordinary criminal trial, but a trial with 4 victorious powers, several languages, numerous defendants, an international press, and an almost unmanageable amount of documents. Interpreting booths were set up, technical equipment for simultaneous translation was installed, and seats were created for the prosecution, defense, and press. The world should be able to follow the trial. This was a significant difference from secret settling of accounts or purely military punitive actions. Nuremberg should be visible. The public was part of the trial because the evidence was not only intended to convince judges, but also to document history. The Allies knew that this trial would not only judge individual men. It would also show how the victorious powers dealt with their victory. A trial in Nuremberg was intended to make it clear that the punishment of the Nazi leadership was not mere revenge, but was based on rules, charges, evidence, and defense. The defendants were given lawyers, could speak, could present documents, and name witnesses. This was precisely to make the difference between the right of the victors and the injustice of the defeated regime visible. The National Socialist system had disenfranchised, abused, and murdered its opponents. The Allies wanted to show that even heavily incriminated perpetrators could not simply be eliminated without trial. Nevertheless, Nuremberg was also politically sensitive. The city was located in the American occupation zone, and the United States had a strong interest in shaping the organization of the proceedings. At the same time, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had to be involved on an equal footing. Each power brought its own experiences, interests, and expectations. For the Soviet Union, the focus was on the German War of Annihilation in the East, which had claimed unimaginable victims. For France, the experience of occupation was central. For Great Britain, the fight against the German war machine. For the United States, the idea of a publicly documented legal process that would also shape future international order. Nuremberg therefore became a place where not only German guilt was negotiated, but also Allied cooperation. The choice of Nuremberg also had a psychological effect. For many Germans, the city was still associated with the images of the Nazi party rallies. They had seen in the cinema, in newspapers and newsreels how National Socialist power had been celebrated there. Now they saw the same city in a completely different light. Instead of marching columns and cheers, defendants stood on the bench. Instead of flags and speeches, there were files, witness statements, and films of evidence. Instead of submission to the Führer, the question of personal responsibility was raised. This change was profound. Nuremberg showed how quickly the staging of power can disintegrate when its crimes become visible. At the same time, the place made it clear that National Socialism had not only begun in the last months of the war or in the camps. His crimes had a history of ideology, propaganda, legislation, and social mobilization. Nuremberg recalled this connection. The trial should not only deal with the last excesses of the war, but also the ways to get there. War of aggression, deprivation of rights, persecution, occupation terror, and mass murder were not separate events. They belonged to a system that had once solemnly presented itself even in Nuremberg. The city itself was severely marked after 1945. Large parts of the historic old town were destroyed by bombing raids. Between ruins, and provisional reconstruction, a trial now took place that judged the past and at the same time prepared a new future. This environment gave the process a special atmosphere. The courtroom was not an abstract space far removed from the consequences of the war. Outside, one could see the destruction that this war had also brought to Germany. Inside, negotiations were held on how this war had been planned, started, and fought. The ruins were silent witnesses of a catastrophe, the causes of which were now to be legally and historically revealed. So why Nuremberg? Because this city, like hardly any other place, bundled the contradictions of the National Socialist era. It stood for seduction through mass staging, for the transformation of racial fanaticism into law, for the regime's claim to historical greatness, and finally for its complete collapse. At the same time, it offered a suitable courthouse, secure detention facilities, and a place that the world public could charge with meaning. Nuremberg had been a stage, and Nuremberg became a stage again. But this time not for triumph, but for prosecution. Not for blind obedience, but for proof. Not for the glorification of power, but for the question of whether law could find a voice again after an age of violence. Nuremberg thus became the name of a historical turning point. The trial could have taken place elsewhere, but nowhere would the place itself have spoken so clearly. The city commemorated the rise of the regime and became the scene of its legal reckoning. The place of propaganda became a place of documentation. The city of party congresses became the city of trials. And this was precisely the real significance of Nuremberg. It became apparent here that power that considers itself unassailable may one day be faced with the questions it has evaded for so long. Chapter 4. The idea of an international court of justice. The idea of bringing the leaders of National Socialist Germany before an international court did not suddenly arise after the capitulation. It grew during the war, from the news of massacres, occupation terror, deportations, camps, and the systematic extermination of entire population groups. Long before the Allied soldiers opened the gates of the concentration camps, governments in exile, resistance groups, diplomats, secret services, and individual refugees had been collecting reports on German crimes. Some information seemed almost incomprehensible at first, because it exceeded any previous idea of state violence. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that after a victory over Hitler's Germany, it would not be enough merely to conclude a peace treaty or to stipulate reparations. The world would have to ask itself what to do with those who had planned, ordered, and organized war of aggression, occupation, terror, and mass murder. This question was also so difficult because there was no clear model. After previous wars, rulers had been overthrown, borders redrawn, territories occupied, compensation demanded, or individual soldiers punished for concrete acts of violence. But an international court that would indict leaders, military officers, and officials of a defeated state for crimes against peace, humanity, and the laws of war was something new. It was not about ordinary crime, but about crimes committed by a state, its institutions, and its means of power. This was precisely the challenge. How could law be applied against people who had themselves created laws, given orders, and dominated entire administrations? How could personal responsibility be established when the crimes in ministries, headquarters, party offices, police authorities, industrial enterprises, and camps had been organized according to the division of labor? There were different ideas about this within the Allied leadership. Some wanted to forego long court proceedings and punish the main perpetrators quickly after their arrest. This attitude arose not only from feelings of revenge, but also from real concern. A trial could offer the defendants a stage. Men like Hermann Göring were experienced speakers and political self-promoters. They could try to portray themselves as patriots, soldiers, or victims of the victors. In addition, some feared that a trial could sink into legal disputes, while the public expected quick justice. After all the suffering, after the destroyed cities and the liberated camps, it seemed almost unbearable to many to listen patiently to the perpetrators. Others considered a public trial to be indispensable precisely for this reason. They argued that a quick execution of the Nazi leaders would be immediate retaliation, but not a lasting answer to the crimes. Without a trial, much would remain in the dark. The perpetrators could be stylized as martyrs. Later generations could claim that the accusations were exaggerated or politically fabricated. A court, on the other hand, could secure documents, hear witnesses, reveal channels of command, and make it visible that the National Socialist crimes had not arisen out of chaos or chance, but out of ideology, planning, administration, and conscious decision. A trial should not only punish, but also prove. The United States in particular finally pushed for a legally orderly procedure. Behind this was the idea that the victory over National Socialism had to be justified not only militarily, but also morally and legally. If the Allies wanted to show that they represented a different order than the defeated regime, they had to abide by rules themselves. The defendants should not simply disappear, but be charged, defended, and convicted or acquitted on the basis of evidence. That was an important difference. The National Socialist regime had turned law into an instrument of persecution. The International Court of Justice, on the other hand, was supposed to show that law could once again be used as a standard even after an age of extreme violence. Great Britain initially fluctuated more strongly. There, too, there were voices that preferred a quick political decision. It was known how enormous the organizational effort of such a procedure would be. Files had to be found, translated, and evaluated. Witnesses had to be protected and questioned. The jurisdiction of an international court had to be defined in the first place. There was also the question of whether the defendants should be allowed to make the policy of the Allies themselves the object of their defense. Nevertheless, the view that a trial would be historically wiser than a mere settling of accounts was increasingly gaining ground in London. A trial was able to show the world public why these men were not on trial for their defeat, but for their deeds. For the Soviet Union, the punishment of German war criminals was also of enormous importance. No country had suffered greater losses in the war against Hitler's Germany than the Soviet Union. The German war in the East had been waged with particular brutality. Millions of Soviet soldiers had fallen or died in captivity. Countless civilians had been murdered, villages destroyed, cities besieged, and entire regions devastated. Moscow wanted to make German crimes visible and achieve harsh punishments. At the same time, the Soviet side brought its own political ideas with it. The trial should also emphasize the tremendous sacrifices of the Soviet Union and unequivocally condemn German aggression. As a result, it was clear from the outset that the court would not be created in a politically neutral space. It was a joint project of victorious powers that shared a common goal but had different experiences and interests. France, in turn, entered the proceedings as an occupied and liberated country. The German occupation had left deep marks: repression, deportations, forced labor, economic plunder, cooperation, and resistance. France wanted to show that the German crimes had taken place not only in the East and not only in the camps, but also in the occupied countries of Western Europe. For the French side, Nuremberg was therefore also a place where the dignity of a humiliated country was to be restored. France's involvement made it clear that the trial was not just a matter for the major military powers, but a response to the destruction of Europe as a whole. The real breakthrough came with the agreement of the four powers on the basis of the court. In London, representatives of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union negotiated the legal form, jurisdiction, and charges. This resulted in the London Statute, which was adopted in August 1945. It was the birth certificate of the International Military Tribunal. It formulated the categories that would later become decisive for Nuremberg: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These terms were not only legal tools, but an expression of a new way of thinking. They said that certain acts were so serious that they could no longer be treated as the internal affair of a state or the normal consequence of war. Above all, the concept of crimes against humanity had a profound meaning. He focused on murder, enslavement, deportation, persecution, and other inhumane acts against civilian populations. This made it clear that the state could not be the last moral shield of its leadership. If a regime systematically disenfranchised and exterminated its own population or subjugated people, it could not claim that this was covered by national laws. This was exactly one of Nuremberg's biggest innovations. The court was supposed to show that there is a minimum of humanity that even states must not destroy with impunity. Equally significant was the charge of crimes against peace. This shifted the focus to the planning and conduct of a war of aggression. World War II should not be viewed as just a series of military events, but as the result of deliberate political choices. War of aggression was understood as a serious crime because it had created the prerequisite for countless other crimes. Without the conquest of Poland, without the invasion of the Soviet Union, without the occupation of Europe, many of the later murders, deportations, and coercive measures would not have been possible in this form. Nuremberg therefore linked the question of war with the question of humanity. Nevertheless, the idea of an international court of justice remained fraught with tensions. The defendants would claim that they had acted according to the law, only carried out orders or made decisions in a war as statesmen. The defense would ask whether the Allies were allowed to apply new legal terms retrospectively. Critics would speak of victor's justice. These objections were predictable, and that is precisely why the trial had to be carefully prepared. The Allies did not want to give the impression that the verdict had already been determined, even if the moral guilt of many of the defendants seemed obvious. The court had to show that individual responsibility was examined and that not every defendant would automatically be convicted. The idea of the court of justice was therefore a risk. It was born out of the desire for justice, out of political necessity, out of moral outrage, and out of the need to hold on to the truth. It was not free of interests and not free of contradictions. But it was a step away from mere retaliation and toward a new conception of international responsibility. For the first time, men who had acted in the name of a state were to appear before a court of the world and answer not only for individual orders, but for an entire system of violence. This prepared Nuremberg. The defendants were not yet in the courtroom, the evidence had not yet been fully organized, and many legal questions were still open. But the decisive idea was born. Power should no longer mean that guilt remains invisible. Rank, office, and uniform should not be enough to ward off responsibility. The International Court of Justice was an attempt to find a form of moderation after a war without measure. It was intended to show that even after the greatest collapse of Europe, not only revenge but justice could be pronounced. It was precisely this hope that gave rise to one of the most important trials in modern history. Chapter 5. The London Statute. When the Allies discussed the legal basis for the coming trial in the summer of 1945, they were faced with a task that went far beyond ordinary criminal justice. It was not just a matter of punishing individual murders, individual orders, or individual war crimes. It was a matter of translating an entire system of political violence into a legal language. National Socialism had combined war of aggression, occupation terror, racial ideology, deportations, forced labor, and mass murder. His crimes had not been accidental outbursts by individual perpetrators, but had been part of a state order that had put ministries, the military, the police, the party, the judiciary, the administration, and the economy at the service of war and destruction. This is precisely why conventional ideas of guilt are not enough. The Allies had to determine the rules under which people could be charged who had acted in the name of a state and whose actions had often been concealed by orders, laws, and bureaucratic procedures. The decisive negotiations took place in London. Representatives of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union came together to lay the foundation for an international military tribunal. Each of these powers brought its own experiences, interests, and expectations. The United States was particularly pressing for a public, orderly trial that would show the world that the punishment of the Nazi leadership was not mere revenge. On the one hand, Great Britain wanted legal certainty, and on the other hand, a procedure that would not fray in endless political debates. France wanted to make the crimes of the occupation visible and restore the dignity of a country that had suffered under German rule. Finally, the Soviet Union wanted to denounce the German war of annihilation in the East with all its might, because the Wehrmacht, together with the SS, police, and occupation administration, had left a trail of tremendous destruction there. These negotiations resulted in the London Statute of August 8, 1945. It was the legal birth certificate of the International Military Tribunal. It set out how the court should be composed, what rights the defendants would have, what acts could be charged, and what principles should apply to the trial. The statute was short, but its importance was enormous. It turned the political will to punish into a legal order. Thus, Nuremberg did not simply become a reckoning of the victors, but a trial with prosecution, defense, judges, evidence, and verdicts. It was precisely this form that was important, because the trial was to prove to the world that even the most serious guilt did not have to be dealt with outside the law. At the heart of the London Statute were three broad categories of crimes. The first category was crimes against peace. This was primarily understood to mean the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of a war of aggression or a war in violation of international treaties. This formulated an idea that was of great importance for legal history. Not only atrocities during a war could be punishable, but even the deliberate unleashing of a criminal war. The National Socialist leadership had not simply reacted to external threats, but had been working for years towards expansion, conquest, and violence. The invasion of Poland in 1939, the war against the Soviet Union in 1941, and the occupation of large parts of Europe were not accidental developments, but the result of political planning. Nuremberg was intended to show that war of aggression was not allowed to be a normal means of state policy. The second category was war crimes. Here, the statute was more closely linked to already known rules of martial law. These included the murder and mistreatment of prisoners of war, the killing of hostages, the looting of occupied territories, the deportation of civilians to forced labor, the destruction of towns and villages without military necessity, and other violations of the rules of war in force at the time. Especially in the occupied territories of Europe, such crimes had been committed en masse. In Poland, the Soviet Union, the Balkans, France, the Netherlands, and many other countries, German authorities had terrorized civilian populations, brutally persecuted resistance, and organized economic exploitation. The statute made it clear that war was not lawless. There were also limits in war, and anyone who deliberately crossed these boundaries could be held personally responsible. The third category was perhaps the most consequential: crimes against humanity. It included murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts against civilian populations, as well as persecution on political, racial, or religious grounds. With this category, the law was brought to a point where it no longer concerned only states and soldiers, but humanity as a moral community. In essence, the term said, there are crimes that are so serious that they do not only affect a single country, a single group, or a single victim, but attack the foundations of human coexistence. The National Socialist persecution of the Jews, the deportations, the murder of Sinti and Roma, the killing of people with disabilities, the violence against political opponents, and many other crimes should not be dismissed as an internal affair of Germany. It was precisely this category that was revolutionary and problematic at the same time. It was revolutionary because it broke through the protective claim that a state can do whatever it wants with its own citizens, as long as it is covered by its laws. It was problematic because the defense was later able to argue that new legal terms were being applied retrospectively. The London Statute therefore moved in a difficult area of tension. On the one hand, the Allies did not want to allow the perpetrators to hide behind formal law. On the other hand, The process had to remain credible and not appear to be an afterthought invention of the victors. The statute's response was to place Nazi crimes in a combination of existing martial law norms, international treaties, and new legal categories. This created a bridge between old and new international law. Another important point of the statute was personal responsibility. The defendants should not be able to claim that they had only acted as state organs. A minister, a general, a party leader, or a high official could also be responsible if he had been involved in planning, carrying out, or supporting the crimes. Likewise, the reference to orders should not automatically absolve one of guilt. Those who had acted only on orders could cite this circumstance as a mitigation, but it was not a complete acquittal of responsibility. This rule was of enormous importance. The National Socialist system had been based on obedience, hierarchy, and command structures. If everyone involved had simply been able to say that they had only carried out instructions, the responsibility in the system would have disappeared. The statute tried to prevent this escape from guilt. At the same time, the London Statute regulated the possibility of classifying organizations as criminal. This affected, for example, the SS, the Gestapo, the Security Service, or the leadership of the NSDAP. This, too, was a new and delicate idea. Not every ordinary member of an organization should be automatically held responsible for all crimes, but the court should be able to determine whether certain organizations had served as instruments of terror and persecution. This made it clear that National Socialist violence was not only borne by individuals, but by institutions. Modern mass murder was not only the work of fanatical individuals, but the result of organized power. The statute also established procedural rights. The defendants should be informed of the accusations against them. They should have defense lawyers, present evidence, question witnesses, and be allowed to express themselves. These rights were not mere formalities. They were part of the message of the trial. The men, who had themselves been involved in a system that had deprived millions of people of their rights, were now being tried before the eyes of the world. There was a moral tension in this, but also a deliberate demarcation. The court was not supposed to act according to the methods of the dictatorship, but according to rules that were verifiable and public. Of course, the London Statute could not eliminate all contradictions. The Allies were victors and judges at the same time. The Soviet Union sat at the judges' table, even though it also pursued political interests and had itself committed acts that were not the subject of the proceedings. The bombing of German cities, the expulsion of millions of people, and other Allied decisions were not negotiated in the same way at Nuremberg. This asymmetry remained a point of attack for critics. But it does not follow that the accused crimes were unreal or unlawfully prosecuted. The statute was not a perfect expression of ideal world justice, but a historic attempt to make legal responsibility possible in the aftermath of an unprecedented disaster. Its real meaning, therefore, lay not only in the paragraphs, but in the principle it formulated. State leaders could no longer hide behind sovereignty as a matter of course. A war could be considered a crime. Systematic persecution could be understood as an attack on humanity. Orders could not erase responsibility. Organizations could become tools of criminal politics. All these ideas later shaped international criminal law and influenced the development of human rights, war crimes tribunals, and international courts. The London Statute was thus a document between the past and the future. It reacted to the crimes of National Socialism, but at the same time it created terms that had an impact far beyond 1945. In Nuremberg, these terms were to be used on a large scale for the first time. Political outrage turned into indictment. Moral horror turned into evidence gathering. The question of revenge turned into an attempt at a verdict. The statute gave form to this attempt. Without it, the Nuremberg trial would not have existed in its familiar form. It was the framework in which the world tried after the war not only to lament the inconceivable, but to name it legally. Chapter 6. The Defendants. When the Nuremberg war crimes trial began, men who had been among the most powerful figures in Europe just a few months earlier were in the dock. They had been ministers, military leaders, party officials, diplomats, ideologues, bureaucrats, and organizers of a state that had combined war, terror, and annihilation. Now they no longer wore a uniform of power, but headphones for translation, sat under guard in the courtroom, and had to listen to how their names were associated with war of aggression, deportations, murder, forced labor, and crimes against humanity. This sight in particular had an enormous symbolic effect. The men who had once decided the fate of millions now became defendants themselves. Their rank, their titles, and their proximity to Hitler no longer protected them. The selection of the defendants was of great importance. Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels were no longer alive. They had evaded responsibility by committing suicide. Others had fled, gone into hiding, or had not yet been caught. So the trial could not be held against all the main culprits. Nevertheless, the Allies wanted to use the dock to show a picture of the National Socialist system of rule. Not only individual, particularly cruel perpetrators were to sit there, but representatives of the regime's most important areas of power. The political leadership, the Wehrmacht, the SS, diplomacy, the economy, propaganda, racial ideology, and the administration were to become visible. Nuremberg was to make it clear that the Nazi state was not just Hitler, but a network of men, institutions, and interests that had made his crimes possible. The most prominent figure among the defendants was Hermann Göring. He had been Reich Marshal, former commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, commissioner for the four-year plan, and Hitler's designated successor for a long time. Göring embodied like no other the combination of power, pomp, violence, and personal vanity in the National Socialist system. He had played an early role in the establishment of the Gestapo, was involved in the economic preparations for war, profited from expropriations and art theft, and bore responsibility for central decisions of the regime. In the courtroom, he tried to present himself as a statesman and soldier. He spoke confidently, contradicted, provoked, and repeatedly sought the stage. But it was precisely his importance that made him particularly important for the prosecution. Göring showed that the leadership of the Reich did not consist of passive followers, but of men who consciously used power and knew its consequences. Next to Göring sat Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy in the party. His role was peculiar because he had already flown to Great Britain in 1941, apparently in the hope of reaching an understanding between Germany and Great Britain. Since then, he had lived in British captivity. In the trial, Hess often seemed absent, confused, or demonstratively uninterested. Nevertheless, his indictment was symbolically significant. It stood for the early phase of the Nazi movement, for the party organization, for the ideological proximity to Hitler, and for the years in which the National Socialist dictatorship was consolidated internally. Even though he had not worked in Berlin for a large part of the war, he remained a representative of the political movement that had opened the way to war and persecution. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former Reich foreign minister, embodied the diplomatic side of the war of aggression. His task had been to represent the regime's aggressive policy to the outside world, to form alliances, to deceive opponents, and to prepare for war diplomatically. His role in the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, which prepared the partition of East Central Europe with a secret additional protocol and facilitated the way to attack Poland, weighed particularly heavily. Ribbentrop later tried to portray himself as a tool of Hitler, as someone who had only carried out orders. But it was precisely the foreign policy of the Reich that showed how consciously the National Socialist leadership used international treaties, threats, and deceptions to push ahead with its expansion. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl stood for the military leadership. Keitel was head of the High Command of the Wehrmacht. Jodl headed the Wehrmacht command staff. Both were not mere frontline soldiers, but men at the center of military planning and command. They were accused of having been involved in the preparation and implementation of the war of aggression and of having passed on or supported criminal orders. These included orders in connection with the war against the Soviet Union, which was not waged as a normal military conflict, but as an ideological war of annihilation. The prosecution against them posed a particularly sensitive question: how far did the responsibility of the Wehrmacht extend? Could the military leadership claim that it had only fulfilled strategic tasks, while the political crimes belonged to others? Nuremberg fundamentally questioned this separation. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the highest-ranking representative of the SS and police apparatus to be indicted in Nuremberg. After the murder of Reinhard Heydrich, he had become head of the Reich Security Main Office, the central authority in which the Gestapo, criminal police, and security service converged. This office was deeply involved in persecution, deportation, terror, and mass murder. Kaltenbrunner tried to downplay his responsibility and present himself as a figure who came later. But his office stood for the heart of the National Socialist repressive apparatus. It showed how bureaucratically violence could be organized. Murder did not only happen through fanaticism on the ground, but also through files, orders, responsibilities, transports, and administrative channels. Alfred Rosenberg, on the other hand, embodied the ideological dimension of the regime. He was one of the most important racial theorists of National Socialism and later Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories. His writings and political ideas provided part of the worldview with which conquest, oppression, and annihilation were justified. Rosenberg was not a charismatic mass leader like Hitler and not a powerful organizer like Himmler, but his importance lay in ideological preparation. It helped to classify people into categories of value and worthlessness, to regard peoples as enemies or workers, and to make violence appear as a historical necessity. In Nuremberg, this made it clear that ideas can have deadly consequences when they are turned into politics by a state. Julius Streicher was also in the dock, although he had no longer held a central government function during the war. His importance lay above all in his role as an anti-Semitic agitator and publisher of the hate paper Der Stürmer. For years, Streicher had spread a language of dehumanization that portrayed Jews as enemies, pests, and dangers. His indictment made it clear that propaganda was not harmless. It prepared violence intellectually, poisoned social perceptions, and contributed to the fact that exclusion, deportation, and murder seemed conceivable or even justified to many people. Streicher stood for the power of the word in the service of hatred. Other defendants showed the breadth of the system. As Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, Walther Funk was associated with the financial and economic side of the regime. Hjalmar Schacht, also a former Reichsbank president and economist, stood for the early rearmament policy and the question of how economic elites had made the rise and war capability of the regime possible. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, presented himself in the trial as a technocratic manager who took responsibility but at the same time limited his role. Speer in particular showed a particularly modern form of guilt, not the roaring ideologue, but the efficient organizer who kept production, forced labor, and the war economy going, and later tried to distinguish himself from the more fanatical perpetrators as an insightful expert. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, stood for an occupation regime characterized by exploitation, terror, and murder. In Poland, German rule had taken on a particularly brutal form. There, elites were persecuted, Jews were forced into ghettos, forced labor was organized, and later deportations to extermination camps were carried out. Frank tried to show remorse at times during the trial, but his own speeches and documents weighed heavily on him. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who worked as Reich Commissioner in the occupied Netherlands, among other things, stood for German rule in Western Europe, for repression, deportations, and the integration of occupied countries into the German war economy. Baldur von Schirach, the former Reich youth leader, embodied the education and seduction of youth. Under his responsibility, millions of young people had been integrated into National Socialist organizations. They should learn to take obedience, sacrifice, racial thinking, and leadership beliefs for granted. His presence showed that dictatorships exist not only through the police and army, but also through education, rituals, community feelings, and the imprint of a generation. Fritz Sauckel, as General Plenipotentiary for the deployment of labor, stood for the mass deportation of people to forced labor. Millions of men and women from occupied countries were brought to the Reich or exploited in occupied territories for German interests. Sauckel's role made it clear that the German war economy would not have functioned without coercion, deprivation of rights, and kidnapping. Not all defendants were evaluated equally in the end. Some were sentenced to death, others received long prison sentences, and some were acquitted. It was precisely these differences that were important, because they showed that Nuremberg was not simply a blanket condemnation of all defendants. The court examined individual responsibility, even if the political and moral burden of the entire trial was enormous. The acquittals were controversial, but at the same time they strengthened the claim that it was a court case and not just a symbolic reckoning. The defendants of Nuremberg were therefore more than a group of defeated men. They were a cross-section of the power structure of the Third Reich. Each of them represented an area without which the system would not have functioned: political leadership, war, diplomacy, administration, propaganda, ideology, police, economy, armaments, and occupation. The trial made it clear that modern crimes are not only created by individual orders, but by the cooperation of many agencies. The doc thus became a mirror of the regime. She showed how ideas became laws, laws became orders, orders became transports, and transports became mass murder. It is precisely for this reason that chapters of the accused were central to Nuremberg's historical significance. The world did not see the one perpetrator to whom everything could be blamed. She saw men with different tasks, characters, and defense strategies, who together had supported a criminal system. Some seemed cold, some defiant, some meek, some seemingly insightful. But behind her personal appearances there was a greater truth. The catastrophe of National Socialism was not the work of a single hand. It was the result of a rule in which many people exercised power, bore responsibility, and later tried to detach themselves from the consequences of their actions. Nuremberg forced them to face this responsibility, at least in court. Chapter 7. The Prosecutors and Judges. The Nuremberg trial was not only a trial against the leading representatives of the National Socialist regime. At the same time, it was a huge political and legal experiment, supported by 4 victorious powers who wanted to judge crimes together, even though they had different legal traditions, different war experiences, and different political interests. In the courtroom of Nuremberg, therefore, not only defendants and witnesses met, but also different ideas of law, justice, history, and power. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had to agree on common rules, formulate common charges, and conduct a trial that would appear credible to the eyes of the world. This cooperation in particular was remarkable, because although the war had united the Allies against Hitler's Germany, new tensions were already emerging in 1945 that would soon lead to the Cold War. The judges of the International Military Tribunal came from the 4 victorious powers. Each power provided a chief judge and a deputy. It was presided over by British Judge Geoffrey Lawrence, an experienced lawyer who was supposed to give the proceedings external order, dignity, and discipline. His task was difficult because the process was exceptional in every way. There were many defendants, multiple languages, thousands of documents, international press, political expectations, and defense attorneys who repeatedly tried to question the jurisdiction of the court or the legitimacy of the charges. Lawrence had to make sure that the trial did not slide into endless debates of principle, but at the same time did not give the impression that the defense was suppressed. His role revealed one of Nuremberg's central challenges. The court had to be strict without appearing arbitrary, and it had to judge decisively without looking like a mere tool of the victors. Francis Biddle, former U.S. Attorney General, sat on the bench for the United States. His country played a particularly formative role in the form of the trial. The American side was convinced that a public trial with extensive evidence was necessary not only to punish the crimes of National Socialism, but to document them permanently. The United States brought in a strong procedural and documentary orientation. They did not only want to show moral outrage, but also to combine files, orders, protocols, films, and statements in such a way that a coherent picture of National Socialist rule emerged. This attitude also reflected the American claim to help shape a new international order after the war, in which law, treaties, and institutions were to play a greater role. The Soviet side was represented by Judge Iona Nikitchenko. For the Soviet Union, the trial had a special emotional and political significance. No country had made more sacrifices in the war against Germany. The German attack of June 22, 1941 had opened a war of annihilation that destroyed cities, burned down villages, killed millions of people and caused immeasurable suffering. For Moscow, Nuremberg was therefore above all a place where German crimes in the East had to be made visible. At the same time, the Soviet judiciary brought with it a different tradition than the Western legal systems. In the Soviet Union, political processes were often strongly controlled by the state, and the idea of an open, controversial process had a different meaning there. This led to tensions, because while the Western judges attached great importance to procedural rights and formal credibility, the Soviet side often expected a particularly clear and harsh sentence. France was represented by Judge Henri Donadieu de Webers, a respected criminal lawyer who had dealt with international criminal law even before the war. France's role in Nuremberg was shaped by the experience of the occupation. The country had experienced the humiliation of military defeat, German occupation, collaboration, resistance, repression, and deportations. For France, therefore, it was not only about the major strategic decisions of the war, but also about the violence in occupied Europe. The French prosecution placed particular emphasis on the treatment of the civilian population, forced labor, plundering, shooting of hostages, and deportations. The French perspective reminded us that National Socialism was not only criminal in the extermination camps and on the Eastern Front, but also in the everyday occupation rule over subjugated countries. On the side of the prosecution, the American Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson was one of the outstanding figures. Jackson was a judge on the Supreme Court of the United States and had taken on the task of shaping the American impeachment strategy. He understood Nuremberg not only as a criminal trial, but as a moment of historical responsibility. His opening speech became one of the best-known texts of the trial because it formulated the claim that civilization must not remain silent when a state makes war and mass crimes a political tool. Jackson wanted to show that the defendants were not on trial for their defeat, but for deliberate decisions that had led Europe into war and annihilation. For him, it was particularly important to make the conspiracy to plan and carry out a war of aggression visible. The war should not appear as a tragic chain of circumstances, but as the result of a will to expand. Jackson's method was heavily based on documents. The National Socialists had recorded their rule extensively themselves. Orders, meeting minutes, decrees, statistics, letters and speech manuscripts were now used against their authors and recipients. That was a bitter irony of history. A regime that had bureaucratically organized and documented its power left behind a trail of paper that became an indictment in the courtroom. Jackson and his team wanted to leave as little room as possible for mere assertions. They wanted to confront the perpetrators with their own words, signatures, and administrative files. This gave rise to a new form of historical reasoning, in which the modern state was convicted by its own documents. The British Chief Prosecutor Hartley Shawcross brought a different, but equally important perspective. Great Britain had been waging war against Germany since 1939 and had experienced air raids, the threat of a possible invasion, and the long military endurance. The British prosecution particularly emphasized the violation of international treaties and planned aggression. It was important for Britain to show that Hitler's Germany had not acted out of legitimate security interests, but was breaking treaties, invading states, and using diplomacy as an instrument of deception. Shawcross combined legal argumentation with moral acuity. He also wanted to make it clear that the war of aggression itself was the origin of many other crimes. The French prosecution under François de Menthon and later Auguste Champetier de Ribes focused strongly on the crimes against the civilian population and on the exploitation of occupied countries. France brought in the experience of a country that had suffered under German occupation and in which resistance, collaboration, and state collapse had left deep wounds. The French prosecutors described how German rule meant not only military control, but also economic plunder, cultural humiliation, labor, police violence, and deportation. In doing so, they broadened their view beyond the top leadership to the concrete reality of the occupation. The Soviet prosecution, led by Roman Rudenko, focused on the crimes in the East. It presented evidence of mass shootings, destroyed cities, murdered prisoners of war, burned villages, and the siege of Leningrad. For the Soviet Union, the trial was also a place of remembrance of the enormous suffering of its own population. At the same time, Soviet participation was politically burdened because certain issues could not or should not be negotiated openly. The most famous example was the Katyn massacre, in which thousands of Polish officers were murdered by the Soviet secret police, while the Soviet Union tried to shift responsibility to Germany. Such moments showed the limits of Nuremberg. The court found central German crimes, but it was not a comprehensive tribunal on all the violence of the war. The cooperation of the prosecutors was therefore never free of tensions. The four powers had to decide what evidence to present, which charges to emphasize, and what political difficulties to avoid. They worked together, but not always harmoniously. Different legal cultures collided. The Anglo-American procedure was heavily focused on oral hearing, cross-examination, and procedural fairness. The continental European traditions placed greater emphasis on files and judicial investigations. The Soviet side, on the other hand, brought with it a more politicized idea of criminal justice. Nuremberg had to create a functioning form out of all this. The fact that the process took place in an orderly manner at all was already an enormous organizational achievement. The language was also a challenge. The trial was conducted in German, English, French, and Russian. Simultaneous translation played a central role and made Nuremberg a technical and organizational milestone. Judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, defendants, witnesses, and journalists had to be able to understand what was being said. Translation was not only a practical question, but also a question of accuracy. Legal terms, military orders, and political statements had to be transmitted in such a way that their meaning was not lost. The headphones in the courtroom became a symbol of the international dimension of the trial. Here, it was not a single state that pronounced justice, but a coalition that tried to establish a common truth across language borders. In the end, the judges were faced with a particularly difficult task. They had to decide not only whether individual defendants were guilty, but also what standards should apply to guilt. How did you evaluate a diplomat who was preparing wars of aggression? A general who passed on criminal orders? A propagandist who sowed hatred? An economic organizer who used forced labor? A minister who managed occupation and plunder? The court had to distinguish between moral outrage and legal accuracy. Not every defendant could be held responsible for everything, but everyone had to be judged by their own contribution. It was precisely this individualization of guilt that was a basic principle of the proceedings. The prosecutors and judges of Nuremberg were thus not neutral figures outside of history. They came from countries that fought, suffered, won, and had their own interests. Nevertheless, they tried to create a procedure that would be more than retaliation. There was a contradiction in her work that still accompanies Nuremberg today. The victors judged the vanquished, but they did not do so simply by shooting or secret decisions, but by public court, by evidence, defense, and verdict. This was precisely the historical significance. The process wasn't perfect, but it set a benchmark. He showed that even after an all-out war, the question of law did not have to be silenced. In the end, the prosecutors and judges stood for the attempt to form a language of responsibility out of the chaos of war. They had to put the incomprehensible in order without trivializing it. They had to grant rights to the defendants, even though they had been involved in a system that had deprived millions of people of any right. They had to balance political interests and still pronounce judgments that could stand up to history. Nuremberg was therefore also their trial, not because they were accused, but because their credibility was also negotiated. If the court failed, the world would have seen just another show of force. But if it was possible to make guilt visible through evidence, something could emerge that went beyond the moment, the idea that even the powerful would one day have to answer to the law. Chapter 8. Evidence of Horror. The Nuremberg trial differed from many earlier court cases primarily in the enormous amount of evidence. The prosecution not only had to prove individual acts, but also make an entire system visible. It was about war of aggression, occupation, deportations, forced labor, mass shootings, concentration camps, extermination camps, and the systematic deprivation of rights of entire population groups. The challenge was to prove the unimaginable in such a way that it could not be dismissed as a mere assertion, not as a revenge narrative of the victors, and not as exaggerated war propaganda. Nuremberg should not only judge, but document. The courtroom thus became a place where files, films, photos, witness statements, and the language of the perpetrators themselves came together. The documents of the National Socialist state were particularly important. The regime had organized its rule with an enormous bureaucracy. It wrote orders, protocols, decrees, reports, statistics, letters, and assessments of the situation. These papers showed how modern and managed the violence had been. The crimes were not only the result of individual outbreaks of cruelty. They had been planned, arranged, forwarded, registered, and evaluated. It was precisely this written form that became a weapon against the defendants in Nuremberg. What had previously meant power now became proof. Signatures, official channels, and formulations made it visible who was involved, who knew, who passed on, and who bore responsibility. The prosecution therefore worked heavily with original files. It presented contracts, military orders, meeting minutes, and administrative documents. They gave rise to a picture of the political and military preparation for war. The attack on Poland, the occupation of Europe, and the war against the Soviet Union no longer appeared as spontaneous reactions to external events, but as the result of long-term planning. Documents showed that the National Socialist leadership had deliberately focused on expansion, conquest, and violence. They proved that diplomacy often served only as a cover, while military and political decisions had already been made in the background. This made the accusation of a crime against peace tangible. Even more shocking was the evidence of the crimes against the civilian population. Reports of the Einsatzgruppen carrying out mass shootings in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe were among the most gruesome documents of the trial. In sober administrative language, numbers of murdered people were listed, places were named, actions were described. It was precisely this cold that made the documents so difficult to bear. They showed how murder had been translated into the language of bureaucracy. People no longer appeared as people, but as numbers, categories, and completed tasks. In Nuremberg, this made it clear that National Socialist violence was not only brutal, but also dehumanized. The films that were shown in the courtroom had a special effect. Many of those present had read files, heard reports, and knew about camps. But moving images reached another level. Footage from liberated concentration camps showed emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, barracks, cremation ovens, mass graves, and traces of systematic abuse. For the audience in the hall, for journalists, and for the world public, this was a moment of confrontation. The violence was no longer just described, it became visible. Even those who tried to distance themselves inwardly could hardly escape the effect of these images. They ripped the crimes out of the realm of abstract numbers and traced them back to human bodies, faces, and places. These film screenings were also significant for the defendants. Some reacted motionlessly, others seemed shaken, and still others tried to shield themselves internally. But regardless of their external reaction, the images had a clear function. They destroyed the possibility of portraying the camps as normal places of detention or regrettable consequences of war. The recordings showed that a systematic world of degradation and annihilation had been created here. Hunger, disease, violence, and death were not coincidences, but components of a system that completely deprived people of their rights, their dignity, and often their lives. Witness testimony supplemented this evidence. Survivors, former prisoners, nationals of occupied countries, civil servants, military officers, and others reported what they had seen, experienced, or helped organize. Testimonies were important because they gave the documents a human voice. A file was able to show that a transport had been ordered. A witness was able to describe what this transport meant for the people who were crammed into cattle cars, separated, beaten, robbed of their belongings, and sent into an uncertain or deadly future. The combination of bureaucratic evidence and personal experience made the crimes particularly clear. Dealing with witness statements was not easy. Many survivors were under the impression of severe traumatization. Some had to speak in front of the men who had been part of the system that had destroyed their lives. Others could only describe excerpts because no single person could see the full extent. But it was precisely these limited perspectives that were valuable. They showed how major political decisions were reflected in the lives of individual people. Behind terms such as deportation, forced labor, or special treatment stood fear, hunger, separation, pain, and death. The evidence also made it clear how closely different branches of the Nazi state cooperated. The Wehrmacht, the SS, the police, ministries, railways, industry, and civil administration were involved in different ways. The deportation of people required lists, orders, transport plans, guards, camp administration, and economic use. Forced labor needed recruitment, violence, distribution, control, and companies that profited from it. The war of annihilation in the East required military planning, ideological justification, orders for harshness, supply concepts, and the will to treat entire populations as inferior or dangerous. Nuremberg showed that modern mass crimes rarely arise from a single institution. They arise when many agencies fulfill their respective tasks and no one recognizes the humanity of the victims. The question of knowledge was particularly important. Many defendants later tried to limit their responsibility. They claimed to have known nothing about certain crimes, to have surveyed only parts of the crimes, or to have been deceived by Hitler and Himmler. The prosecution therefore had to show that knowledge was available, or at least had to be available. Documents, positions, meetings, and command channels played a central role in this. A man who was at the head of a ministry could not credibly claim to have known nothing about measures that were being taken by his agency. A military leader who passed on orders could not completely separate himself from their consequences. A propagandist who engaged in dehumanization for years could not pretend that his language had nothing to do with violence. However, the evidence was not only directed against individual defendants. It also served to capture the character of the entire system. The National Socialist regime had liked to present itself as a movement of order, strength, and national renewal. Nuremberg exposed another reality underneath, a system of rule that destroyed the law, normalized violence, turned lies into politics, and divided people into valuable and worthless according to racist and political categories. The evidence showed that the Nazi language of security, people, space, and duty could be a cover for oppression, robbery, enslavement, and murder. At the same time, the presentation of the evidence had a historic task. The prosecutors knew that the trial was also being conducted for generations to come. Many documents have been saved, translated, sorted, and published. This created an archive of guilt. This archive was important because crimes of this magnitude could later be denied, relativized, or distorted again and again. Nuremberg countered this with the burden of proof. It showed that the story consisted not only of memories, but of traces, files, pictures, and statements that together created a reliable picture. In this sense, the trial was also a fight against forgetting. The courtroom thus became a place of unveiling. Day after day, files were read out, films were shown, witnesses were heard, and connections were explained. The audience did not learn everything at once, but in shifts. First the planning of the war, then the methods of occupation, then the camps, the deportations, the forced labor, the mass shootings, the role of the organizations. The longer the trial lasted, the clearer it became that the crimes were not juxtaposed, but connected. The war of aggression opened up spaces for violence. The ideology declared people to be enemies. The administration organized their exclusion. The police and SS enforced terror. The economy exploited deprivation of rights. The propaganda created approval or indifference. For the world public, this evidence was shocking and necessary at the same time. Many people had only experienced fragments during the war. Others had heard rumors but did not want to believe them. Still others had deliberately looked the other way. Nuremberg forced us to take a look. The trial did not undo the crimes, but it took away the protection of silence. It did not give the victims back their lives, but it did not give the perpetrators the opportunity to completely conceal their actions. The evidence of horror was therefore more than material for a verdict. They were the core of the historical meaning of Nuremberg. They showed how low a modern state can sink when power is separated from morality, and law becomes a tool of violence. They showed that mass murder does not arise in the darkness of uncontrolled barbarism alone, but also in offices, ministries, conference rooms, barracks, train stations, and file folders. Nuremberg made this connection visible. And this was precisely where its lasting significance lay. The horror was not only lamented, but proven. Chapter 9. The Defense of the Defendants. From the very beginning, the defense of the defendants in the Nuremberg trial was faced with an almost impossible task. The evidence was formidable, the moral outrage of the world was great, and the defendants sat in court not as unknown individuals, but as representatives of a regime whose crimes had already been exposed in liberated camps, destroyed cities, mass graves, and countless documents. Nevertheless, their defense was a central part of the proceedings. Precisely because the guilt of many of the defendants seemed politically and morally obvious, the court had to show that it did not judge according to the pattern of the dictatorship, but according to rules. The defendants were given lawyers, were able to file motions for evidence, name witnesses, ask questions, and speak themselves. This right was not an expression of leniency, but a deliberate contrast to the system that had taken away all rights from its victims. The defenders had to fight on several levels. They denied individual allegations, tried to shift responsibilities, questioned the jurisdiction of the court, and attacked the legal basis of the indictment. A central argument was that the Allies would apply new legal terms retrospectively. In particular, the charges of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity were presented by the defense as problematic. The defendants, according to the argumentation, had acted according to the law in force at the time, as statesmen, soldiers, or officials of a sovereign state. If they were now punished for acts that were only defined in this form by the London Statute, then the principle that no one should be punished for something that was not punishable at the time of the offense was violated. This argument was to be taken seriously from a legal point of view, even if it often seemed morally like an attempt to hide the monstrous reality of the crimes behind formalities. The prosecution countered that wars of aggression, mass murder, deportations, shootings of hostages, mistreatment of prisoners of war, and systematic persecution were by no means legally neutral acts. International treaties, martial law, the Hague Conventions, and general legal principles had already set limits before 1939. In addition, according to the prosecution, no state can make mass murder legal through its own laws. It was precisely here that the trial touched on a fundamental question of law. Are there acts that are so serious that they remain unjust even if a regime has ordered them or prepared them by law? The defense tried to draw attention to paragraphs, responsibilities, and command channels. The prosecution tried to make visible the responsibility for a system that had made law itself a mask of injustice. Another important defense argument was the lack of orders. Many defendants or their lawyers claimed that they had merely carried out Hitler's orders. In the National Socialist state, the will of the Führer was decisive, and anyone who resisted would have risked his office, his freedom, or his life. This argumentation was intended to shift responsibility upwards, to Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, or other dead people who were no longer on trial. This gave the impression that the defendants were less independent decision-makers than tools of an all-powerful top. Military and civil servants in particular resorted to this line. They presented themselves as men who had functioned in a hierarchical order and whose personal scope had been limited. But it was precisely this argument that was difficult to credible in many cases. Many of the defendants had not stood on the fringes of the system, but at its center. They were ministers, Reichsleiter, commanders-in-chief, diplomats, governors, economic organizers, or high-party officials. They had not only received orders, but had exercised power themselves, made proposals, tightened measures, pursued careers, and benefited from proximity to the top. The court therefore had to distinguish between a simple subordinate who could act under duress and a high functionary who actively helped shape the system. The mere reference to Hitler could not be enough to extinguish personal responsibility. Nuremberg in particular should show that guilt must not disappear if it is distributed in a chain of command. Closely related to this was the claim of ignorance. Several defendants stated that they had known nothing about the extent of the extermination, about the camps, about mass shootings, or about certain orders. This strategy was particularly important because the National Socialist system often worked with secrecy. Terms were obfuscated, responsibilities were separated, orders were given orally, and many perpetrators hid murder behind bureaucratic formulas. But the indictment showed that complete ignorance was hardly credible among leading men. Anyone who sat in high offices, took part in meetings, received reports, organized transports, administered occupied territories, or carried out propaganda could not credibly claim to have had no idea of the consequences of his actions. Ignorance was often not a fact, but a protective claim. Sometimes it also meant consciously looking the other way. This strategy was particularly evident in the case of defendants who wanted to limit their role to technical or administrative tasks. Albert Speer, for example, presented himself as an efficient organizer of arms production, who took responsibility but had only limited knowledge of the extermination policy. This attitude distinguished him from many other defendants because he admitted guilt, at least in part, and did not hide completely behind Hitler. But even for him, the question remained as to how much this insight was worth and how far it was tactical. Speer's ministry was deeply involved in the use of forced labor. Millions of people had to work under brutal conditions for the German war economy. The defense of the technocrat showed a modern form of exoneration. One did not present oneself as an ideologue, but as an expert who allegedly only had production figures, organization, and efficiency in mind. Nuremberg made it clear that even such seemingly objective administration can bear moral guilt. Other defendants chose a more aggressive line. Hermann Göring tried to use the trial politically. He did not deny every fundamental decision of the regime, but tried to portray National Socialism as a legitimate political movement and the war as the result of power politics. He did not want to appear meek, but as a representative of a defeated, but from his point of view not dishonorable state. This self-dramatization was dangerous because it challenged the prosecution and at times even made an impression. Göring understood the courtroom as a stage. He attacked accusers, relativized accusations, referred to Allied actions, and tried to damage the moral superiority of the victors. His defense strategy was less legal than political. He not only wanted to defend himself, but also to influence the interpretation of the regime. In contrast, other defendants seemed weak, evasive, or contradictory. Joachim von Ribbentrop presented himself as a mere executor of Hitler, although as foreign minister he had played a central role in the aggressive diplomacy of the Reich. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl referred to military obedience and soldierly duty, although their signatures and functions associated them with criminal orders. Hans Frank showed remorse at times, but at the same time tried to limit his responsibility for German rule in Poland. Julius Streicher claimed that he had only written and not killed, but it was precisely his years of anti-Semitic agitation that showed how words can prepare violence. Each defense revealed not only a legal strategy, but also a self-image. Some wanted to appear innocent, some just less guilty, some wanted to be seen as victims of Hitler, some as soldiers, some as patriots, some as men who supposedly had no choice. A recurring motif was the attempt to shift responsibility to organizations, other authorities, or dead decision-makers. The SS was responsible, not the Wehrmacht. Himmler had organized the extermination, not the ministries. Hitler had decided, not the diplomats. The party had agitated, not the administration. However, it was precisely this division that was part of the problem. The National Socialist system had organized crimes based on the division of labor. Anyone could claim to have been only a partial bike. One provided the ideology, the other the laws, the third the transports, the fourth the guarding, the fifth the economic use, the sixth the military security. If everyone only referred to their neckline, the whole thing disappeared. The court's task was to put these excerpts back together. The defense also took up the accusation of victor's justice. She asked why only Germans were charged and why the actions of the Allies were not also investigated. Why were bombing raids on cities, Soviet violence, or political decisions of the victorious powers not dealt with in the same courtroom? These questions were politically explosive and could not be completely resolved. Nuremberg was indeed a court of victors over the vanquished. But this did not automatically mean that the accused crimes were fabricated or that the verdicts were meaningless. The defense used the accusation of victor's justice to shake the legitimacy of the trial. The court had to respond by not only showing moral outrage, but examining concrete evidence and establishing individual guilt. This was precisely the importance of the defense for the trial. She forced the prosecution to be more precise. It forced the court to make distinctions. It prevented all defendants from being convicted across the board. In the end, there were death sentences, long prison sentences, milder sentences, and also acquittals. These acquittals were controversial, but they showed that the trial was not completely predetermined. The trial was not a perfect expression of neutral world justice, but it was more than a mere victory ceremony. The defense had space, even if that space was limited by the weight of evidence. The defense of the defendants thus made a central tension in Nuremberg visible. People who had been involved in a system of deprivation of rights, violence, and annihilation now received rights themselves. They were allowed to speak, argue, deny, relativize, and justify themselves. This was hard to bear, especially for victims and survivors. But this was precisely the difference between justice and revenge. A court does not prove its strength by giving rights only to the innocent, but by granting a trial to the guilty as well. Nuremberg was therefore not only a trial of the crimes of National Socialism, but also a test for the idea that justice must not be abandoned even after the darkest deeds. Chapter 10. Göring in the spotlight. Hermann Göring very quickly became the most conspicuous figure in the dock at the Nuremberg Trials. This was not only due to his rank, although this rank alone was enormous. Göring had been Reich Marshal, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Commissioner for the Four-Year Plan, President of the Reichstag, leading man of the NSDAP, and for a long time the officially recognized second man in the state after Adolf Hitler. He had embodied power in a way that hardly any other defendant could match. But in Nuremberg, it was not only his former position that made him the center of attention. It was his appearance. While other defendants seemed quiet, nervous, evasive, or broken, Göring appeared self-confident. He sought attention, spoke with visible pride about his past, and tried to use the trial not only as a legal dispute, but also as a political stage. Göring understood that the courtroom was more than a room in which judges decided on guilt and punishment. He knew that journalists from all over the world were reporting, that his words were recorded, and that the public was aware of his behavior. Therefore, he tried not to appear like an ordinary defendant. He wanted to appear as a representative of a defeated state, as a former statesman, as a soldier, as a political fighter. This attitude was dangerous because it contained an attempt to retrospectively portray National Socialist rule as normal power politics. Göring did not only want to defend himself. He wanted to influence the interpretation of the regime. He wanted to avoid that the story of the accused was told only as the story of criminals. Instead, he tried to portray himself and his co-defendants as men who had made political decisions in a hard time. It was precisely for this reason that Göring became a particular challenge for the prosecution. Many defendants tried to make themselves small. They claimed that they had only carried out orders, had only individual responsibilities, or knew nothing about the worst crimes. Göring proceeded differently. He did not always evade, but openly admitted certain positions of power. He did not deny that he had been a leading man of the empire, but he tried to put this power in a different light. He spoke of state necessity, of war, of politics, and of command structures. He wanted to mitigate the criminality of the decisions by translating them into the language of power politics. This strategy was not accidental. Göring was experienced enough to know that a total denial of his importance would have seemed ridiculous. so he tried to make a kind of dignity out of his meaning. His behavior in the courtroom also attracted the attention of the co-defendants. At the beginning of the trial, Göring still exercised a kind of leadership role on many of them. Hitler was dead, as were Himmler and Goebbels, and Göring was the most prominent figure of the old regime among the survivors. Some defendants took their cue from him, others feared his influence, and still others wanted to gain distance. The Allies soon realized that Göring was also trying to influence the group while in prison. He was able to influence the atmosphere among the defendants with remarks, gestures, and conversations. That was one of the reasons why they took care to limit their influence. The trial was not intended to become a stage for a closed National Socialist self-presentation. Göring's outward appearance was very different from the image that many knew from the time of his power. He had formerly loved pomp, uniforms, medals, art treasures, hunting residences, and everything that made his position visible. He liked to present himself as a powerful, almost princely man. In Nuremberg, little of this had remained. He had lost a lot of weight, wore simple clothes, and was subject to the rules of prison. But it was precisely this contrast that made his appearance particularly remarkable. The outward glamour had disappeared, but the will to self-dramatize remained. Göring did not want to appear as a broken man. He wanted to show that he had not capitulated inwardly, even if the empire he had served had completely collapsed. For the prosecutors, Göring was particularly important because several central lines of the National Socialist system could be combined in his person. He stood for the early violence of the regime, as he had played an important role in building up the police power apparatus in Prussia. He stood for rearmament, because the Luftwaffe had been built up under his leadership and became a central instrument of German warfare. It stood for economic preparation for war, because the 4-year plan was to orient Germany towards self-sufficiency, rearmament, and conquest. He stood for expropriation and robbery because he profited from the elimination of Jewish owners and art theft. And he stood for the political leadership that not only accepted Hitler's aggression, but actively supported it. Göring's role in connection with the persecution of the Jews weighed particularly heavily. He was not the organizer of the extermination camps, and he tried to shift responsibility onto others, especially Himmler and Heydrich. But documents showed that he was involved in decisive steps. After the November pogroms of 1938, he chaired meetings that dealt with the economic plundering of the Jews and their further deprivation of rights. In 1941, he also instructed Reinhard Heydrich to make preparations for a so-called total solution to the Jewish question. This language was bureaucratic, obfuscating, and deadly. Göring was later able to claim that he did not know the concrete form of the extermination, but the political responsibility for the radicalization of Jewish policy could not simply be brushed off. His person showed how leadership, administration, and murder policy were intertwined. Göring was also heavily burdened in connection with the war of aggression. As head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most important men in the Reich leadership, he was involved in the military preparations. Germany's war policy was based not only on Hitler's will, but on the cooperation of the regime's political, military, and economic elites. Göring played a major role in this cooperation. The 4-year plan was intended to make the German economy fit for war. Raw materials, labor, industry, and agriculture were increasingly geared to the needs of a coming war. This preparation showed that the war did not fall from the sky. It was wanted, planned, and made possible. Göring was one of those men who supported this path with power and conviction. In cross-examination, Göring showed himself to be rhetorically skilled. He was able to evade, exaggerate, provoke, and answer legal questions politically. At times, he managed to get the prosecution into trouble because he did not react like a passive defendant. Robert H. Jackson, the American chief prosecutor, in particular, experienced difficult moments in the direct exchange of blows with Göring. Göring used every opportunity to set his own accents. He tried to turn precise questions into fundamental debates and to place the responsibility of the National Socialist leadership in the larger context of international power politics. But this tactic had its limits. The more the prosecution worked with documents, the less room there was for political fog. The files, orders, and protocols spoke a language that repeatedly broke through Göring's self-portrayal. The trial against Göring also showed how difficult it is to judge people in power after their fall. On the one hand, he was now a prisoner, dependent on the rules of his guards and the verdict of his judges. On the other hand, he remained a man who had held enormous power for years and whose decisions had consequences for millions of people. The danger was to be distracted by his stage presence. Göring could appear witty, sharp, self-confident, and intelligent. But behind this facade stood rearmament, political violence, robbery, war, and shared responsibility for persecution. Nuremberg, therefore, had to do more than evaluate a strong performance. It had to look through the facade to the structures of guilt. His relationship with Hitler played a central role in this. Göring had long seen himself as a loyal follower and at the same time cultivated his own claims to power. He was one of those early National Socialists who not only followed Hitler, but also benefited directly from his rise. His proximity to the dictator gave him offices, influence, and wealth. But in the end, this relationship was also broken. Shortly before the end of the war, Göring had tried to take the lead in the face of Hitler's encirclement in Berlin, which Hitler interpreted as treason. Göring was removed from power and temporarily detained by the SS. In Nuremberg, this break did not help him. He could not credibly appear as an opponent of Hitler just because he had fallen from grace in the last days of the Reich. His responsibility lay not in the last rift, but in the years of power before it. The verdict against Göring was ultimately unambiguous. He was found guilty of all charges involving him and sentenced to death by hanging. For the court, he was one of the central figures of the criminal system. He had prepared and supported war of aggression. He had supported the plundering of occupied territories and persecuted people. He had enabled political violence and profited from it. The judges did not see him as a mere follower, but as a leading perpetrator. Göring himself did not accept the verdict in the sense that he would have acknowledged his guilt. Shortly before the planned execution, he evaded the hang by committing suicide with poison. This, too, was a final act of control, a last attempt to take away the complete disposal of his death from the victorious powers. But his suicide did not change the historical significance of his trial. In Nuremberg, Göring was the most visible attempt by National Socialism to justify itself once again. He wanted to show strength where the system had long since collapsed. He wanted to say politics where crimes were proven. He wanted to assert dignity where responsibility was required. This is precisely why his role in the trial became so important. It showed the struggle between self-portrayal and proof, between the instinct for power and law, between the language of the perpetrators and the language of the documents. Nuremberg made it clear that even the most brilliant appearance cannot erase the traces of guilt. Göring was the center of attention because he was more than a defendant. He was the face of a ruler who had made himself great and now stood before the proofs of his own deeds. Chapter 11. Auschwitz, Einsatzgruppen, and War of Extermination. When the Nuremberg Trials dealt with the crimes of Auschwitz, the Einsatzgruppen, and the German War of Annihilation, the full depth of the National Socialist system of rule came to the fore. By then, the trial had already shown that Hitler's Germany had planned wars of aggression, broken treaties, occupied countries, abducted people, and established a system of brutal violence. But with the controversy over the extermination of European Jews, mass shootings in the East, and the deliberate dissolution of the boundaries of war, it became clear that it was not just a matter of military defeat, political guilt, or individual atrocities. At issue here was a system that not only wanted to defeat, exploit, or dominate people, but also wanted to eliminate them completely for racist and ideological reasons. Auschwitz became a name that went far beyond a single place. The camp near Auschwitz in occupied Poland was not from the beginning the symbol of industrial mass murder as it is remembered today. It developed from a concentration camp into a huge camp complex in which forced labor, terror, medical crimes, and systematic extermination were intertwined. Auschwitz I, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Auschwitz-Monowitz stood for different aspects of the same system. In Birkenau, Large numbers of people were selected immediately after their arrival. Old people, many women with children, the sick, and all those who were not considered fit for work were sent directly to their deaths. Others were forced to work, often in conditions that meant hunger, disease, beatings, and exhaustion. The camp was not an accidental place of violence, but an organized space of dehumanization. For Nuremberg, Auschwitz was important not only as a place, but as proof of where National Socialist ideology had led. The persecution of the Jews did not begin with the gas chambers. She had been radicalized step by step. In the beginning, there was exclusion, agitation, occupational bans, deprivation of rights, and social isolation. Then followed the Nuremberg Laws, the November pogroms, expropriations, ghettoization, deportations, and finally systematic murder. This development showed that genocide does not suddenly arise out of nowhere. He needs language, laws, authorities, habituation, and the willingness to exclude people further and further from the circle of moral obligation. Auschwitz was the end point of a long chain of political, bureaucratic, and ideological decisions. Another, equally shocking dimension was formed by the Einsatzgruppen. These mobile murder squads followed the Wehrmacht after the attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. They consisted of members of the security police and security service and often worked together with the order police, Waffen-SS, local helpers, and other agencies. Their task was not only to secure the rear area, as it was called in the language of the perpetrators. In truth, they became central tools of mass murder. They shot Jews, communist officials, Roma, prisoners of war, and many other people who were defined as enemies. Entire communities were wiped out. Men, women, and children were rounded up, led to pits, forced to undress, and then shot. These acts did not take place in the secret of a distant abstraction, but often close to cities, villages, and streets, sometimes before the eyes of local populations. The reports of the Einsatzgruppen were among the most terrible evidence in Nuremberg. In them, murder was recorded in sober administrative language. Numbers were listed, places were named, actions were described. It was precisely this cold that was shattering. The perpetrators did not write like people experiencing a moral abyss, but like civil servants doing a job. The victim disappeared from the language. What remained were categories, statistics, and success stories. These documents were of great importance to the court because they showed that the mass murder was not merely a consequence of chaotic war. It was planned, reported, evaluated, and integrated into the structures of the state. The war against the Soviet Union formed the larger framework of these crimes. From the outset, it was designed differently from an ordinary military campaign. The National Socialist leadership saw it as a war of ideology. It was about living space, raw materials, the smashing of Bolshevism, and the racist reorganization of Eastern Europe. In this view, entire populations were not seen as people with rights, but as obstacles, workers, or enemies. The starvation plan, the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, the brutal occupation policy, and the destruction of Jewish life were interconnected. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war died from hunger, cold, disease, mistreatment, and deliberate neglect. Entire regions were plundered. Villages were burned down if resistance was suspected there. Civilians were shot as hostages or forced to work. The war in the East was therefore not only a struggle between armies, but an attack on societies. Nuremberg had to show that this violence could not be attributed solely to the SS. The SS and the Reich Security Main Office played central roles, but the Wehrmacht, civilian administrations, ministries, economic agencies, and party organizations were also involved or made the system possible. Military orders created spaces in which violence against civilians was facilitated. Occupation administrations organized exploitation and control. Railways transported people to ghettos, camps, and extermination sites. Companies used forced labor. Propaganda justified the dehumanization. It was precisely this interdependence that was decisive. The war of annihilation was not a marginal phenomenon, but part of the National Socialist project. The defendants tried in different ways to distance themselves from these crimes. Some claimed that they did not know anything. Others referred to Himmler, Heydrich, or Hitler. Military officials spoke of command structures, politicians of responsibilities, administrators of ignorance of individual measures. But the evidence showed that the system was too large, too comprehensive, and too closely linked to state policy to have been completely invisible. Not every defendant knew every detail, every murder action. But many knew enough to understand that a policy of annihilation was being pursued in the East. Anyone who supported deportations, who passed on orders, who administered occupied territories, who organized forced labor or spread anti-Semitic agitation could not credibly present himself as an uninvolved bystander. Auschwitz and the Einsatzgruppen also showed two forms of the same will to exterminate. The mass shootings in the East were immediate, open violence. Perpetrators and victims faced each other. The murder took place in pits, in forests, in fields, near towns and villages. Auschwitz, on the other hand, stood for a more industrialized form of killing, for deportation trains, selections, gas chambers, crematoria, camp administration, and the connection between murder and exploitation. The two forms were not separate from each other, but were an expression of the same ideology. The path to extermination led through many methods, but it followed a common logic. People were first excluded from the community, then deprived of their rights, then deported, then exploited or murdered. Particularly important in Nuremberg was the realization that the Holocaust was not just a secret of a few men. The exact organization of the extermination was partly secret, but its prerequisites were publicly visible. Anti-Semitic propaganda, deprivation of rights, expropriation, labeling, deportations, and the disappearance of entire neighborhoods were not invisible processes. Many people knew something, suspected something, profited from stolen property, or did not ask questions. Nuremberg could not negotiate the guilt of an entire society in the criminal sense, but the trial made it clear that crimes of this magnitude need an environment in which many participate, look the other way, or adapt. For the survivors, the negotiations were of great importance and at the same time difficult to bear. The suffering they had experienced was now translated into legal language. Numbers, documents, and pieces of evidence could never fully express what hunger, fear, loss, humiliation, and the death of families meant. Nevertheless, it was important that their experiences did not disappear in silence. Nuremberg could not do justice to the victims in the sense of restoring the destroyed life. But the trial was able to publicly state that these crimes had happened, that they were organized, and that people bore responsibility for them. In the end, Auschwitz, the Einsatzgruppen, and the War of Annihilation made it clear that National Socialism was more than a dictatorship that had lost a war. It was a system that regarded certain people as unworthy of life, dangerous, or without rights for racist and ideological reasons. This idea gave rise to a policy that ended in gas chambers, firing pits, starvation camps, and burned villages. Nuremberg gave these crimes names, evidence, and those responsible. It showed that murder is no less murder if it is prepared by acts, carried out by uniforms, or justified by ideology. Precisely for this reason, this chapter of the trial was the moral core of Nuremberg. This was not just about contracts, orders, or responsibilities. This was about the question of what happens when a state uses its power to destroy humanity itself. Auschwitz, the Einsatzgruppen, and the War of Annihilation stood for the deepest abyss of the 20th century. The trial could not close this abyss, but it could prevent him from remaining nameless. He forced the perpetrators to sit in front of the traces of their own deeds. And he forced the world to look. Chapter 12. The Verdict. As the Nuremberg trial drew to a close, a peculiar tension hung over the courtroom. For almost a year, documents had been read out, films shown, witnesses heard, defendants questioned, and legal arguments exchanged. The world had gained insight into the mechanics of a state that had carried out war, persecution, and mass murder not as an exception, but as a means of its politics. Now the question was how this enormous burden could be put into judgments. No verdict could bring back the dead, No punishment could compensate for the suffering of the survivors. No legal formula could capture the full extent of Auschwitz, the Einsatzgruppen, the hunger, the deportations, and the destroyed cities. And yet a verdict had to be pronounced. Without the verdict, the trial would have missed its last function. Nuremberg had not only been a historical investigation, but a court. In the end, the law had to give an answer. The judges were faced with a task that was hardly comparable in size to previous proceedings. They did not have to decide on a single murder, a single order, or a single military incident, but on the contribution of men who had been part of a criminal system. Each defendant had played a different role. Some were political leaders, others military, diplomats, ideologues, economic organizers, or administrative officials. Some had given orders, others had spread agitation, still others had exploited occupied territories, organized forced labor, or prepared wars of aggression. The court therefore had to do more than moral outrage. It had to determine individual guilt. This was precisely a core of Nuremberg's claim. Not all defendants should automatically be treated equally. Everyone should be judged according to their responsibility, even if everyone was in the shadow of the same regime. On September 30th and October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were announced. The atmosphere in the hall was tense and heavy. The defendants sat where they had been sitting for months, but now their words, their excuses, and their defense strategies could no longer change. The judges had deliberated, weighed the evidence, and decided. For the public, this moment was more than the conclusion of a trial. It was the moment when the world learned whether Nuremberg had actually been a trial with graduated sentences or just a symbolic conviction of all. The answer was multi-layered. There were death sentences, long prison sentences, milder sentences, and acquittals. It was precisely these differences that showed that the court did not convict every defendant without examination, even if many decisions were later controversially discussed. Hermann Göring was sentenced to death. For the judges, he was one of the central leaders of the National Socialist system. His position of power, his participation in rearmament, his role in the preparation for war, his shared responsibility for persecution, robbery, and terror left no doubt about his importance. Göring had tried to present himself as a political leader and soldier, but the verdict determined him to be the main perpetrator. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, was also sentenced to death. His diplomacy had not served peace, but the preparation of aggression and deception. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, both central figures in the military leadership, also received death sentences. The court thus made it clear that military rank and invocation of orders were not sufficient to ward off responsibility for criminal warfare. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was also sentenced to death. As the highest representative of the Reich Security Main Office present, he stood for the apparatus of Gestapo, security service, terror, deportation, and murder. Alfred Rosenberg, the ideologue and minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, was also sentenced to death. In his case, the verdict showed that ideas, when translated into domination and violence, cannot be excused as mere theory. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, was sentenced to death for his responsibility in a brutal occupation policy. Julius Streicher, whose power had mainly been in anti-Semitic agitation, also received the death penalty. It was precisely this ruling that made it clear that propaganda that systematically degrades people and mentally prepares violence is not harmless. Fritz Sockel, responsible for the mass use of labor, was sentenced to death for the abduction and exploitation of millions of people. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who had played an important role in the occupied Netherlands, among other places, was also sentenced to death. Martin Bormann was sentenced to death in absentia. He had disappeared, and his fate was unclear at the time. As head of the party chancellery and a close confidant of Hitler, he had held a central position in the regime's power structure. His verdict showed that the prosecution also wanted to cover those who did not personally sit on the bench but had belonged to the ruling class. A total of 12 death sentences were pronounced, with Göring later evading execution by committing suicide. The rest sentenced to death were executed in October 1946. For many people, especially victims and survivors, this was a necessary act of justice. For others, the question remained whether the deaths of individual perpetrators could even be an appropriate response to crimes of such magnitude. In addition to the death sentences, there were long prison sentences. Rudolf Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment. His special role as Hitler's early deputy and his long absence from direct warfare after his flight to Britain made his case unusual, but the court considered his involvement in the regime's early power structure to be serious. Albert Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His verdict was controversial from the beginning. Speer had behaved differently from many co-defendants, had taken partial responsibility and presented himself as an insightful technocrat. But his role in the arms industry and in the use of forced labor was heavily burdensome. Many later discussions revolved around whether Speer's controlled remorse was treated more leniently than his actual responsibility. Baldur von Schirach was also sentenced to 20 years in prison. As Reich youth leader and later Gauleiter of Vienna, he stood for the ideological education of young people and for deportations from Vienna. Konstantin von Neurath, former foreign minister and later Reich protector in Bohemia and Moravia, received 15 years in prison. Karl Donitz, Hitler's short-term successor and commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His conviction was also not free of debate, because the conduct of naval warfare and the question of Allied settlement actions were legally difficult. The prison sentences showed that the court tried to make gradations. But they also showed how difficult it was to translate guilt into years when the consequences of politics consisted of millions of deaths. The acquittals were received particularly attentively. Hjalmar Schacht, Franz von Papen, and Hans Fritsch were acquitted. These decisions triggered some strong reactions. Many found it difficult to understand that men who had been connected to the regime in any way could leave the courtroom without punishment. But it was precisely the acquittals that were significant for the legal character of the proceedings. The court thus explained that proximity to the regime alone was not automatically sufficient for a conviction if the specific criminal responsibility, according to the charges, was not sufficiently proven. This did not make Nuremberg any less controversial, but it distinguished the proceedings from a mere political reckoning. A trial in which acquittals were also possible could more credibly claim to administer justice. The reactions to the verdict were different. Many victims and relatives felt that the punishments were necessary, but not sufficient. How could any verdict have been sufficient in view of the murder of millions of people? For them, Nuremberg was an important moment because perpetrators were named and convicted, but there remained a gap between legal punishment and human suffering. In Germany, many people reacted ambivalently. Some saw the trial as a fair reckoning with the leaders of the regime. Others spoke of victor's justice or tried to continue to limit responsibility to a small leadership group. Still others were so busy with survival, foraging, rebuilding, and their own losses that they only perceived the judgments from a distance. The confrontation with guilt did not begin immediately in full depth. For many Germans, Nuremberg initially remained something that came over the country from outside. Internationally, the ruling had an enormous impact. It formulated principles that went beyond the moment. War of aggression was condemned as a crime. Crimes against humanity have been confirmed as a legal category. The reference to state orders or high offices could not erase personal responsibility. Leaders, ministers, generals, and functionaries could no longer hide behind the sovereignty of their state as a matter of course. That was a message of historic significance. Nuremberg said in essence, anyone who murders, persecutes, deports, or wages aggressive war in the name of the state does not automatically act lawfully just because he has power. But the verdict remained marked by tensions. The accusation of victor's justice did not disappear. The Allies had judged German crimes, while their own problematic actions were not dealt with in the same way. Soviet participation was particularly contradictory because the Soviet Union itself had committed political violence and serious crimes. The subsequent formulation of certain legal terms also remained a legal point of contention. This criticism is part of Nuremberg's history. It does not take away the reality of the proven crimes of the accused, but it reminds us that the court was not a completely neutral place outside of power politics. It was a historic procedure in a world that was just emerging from an all-out war. Despite these limitations, the ruling was a turning point. For the first time, leading representatives of a state have been held accountable by an international court for war of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This was more than punishing individual men. It was an attempt to draw a new line between power and law. The judges could not heal the past, but they were able to determine that certain acts could not be excused simply as political decisions or military necessities. They were able to name names, assign guilt, and put what happened into a form that contradicted repression. When the verdicts were pronounced, the main trial ended, but the story of Nuremberg was only just beginning. The question of whether justice had been achieved remained open and was asked anew from generation to generation. For some, Nuremberg was an imperfect but necessary court. For others, it remained a trial of the victors. It became a foundation for the development of international law. The verdict showed that even the highest state power can be limited, at least in retrospect, at least through memory, evidence, and law. It was not complete justice. Perhaps there could never have been such a crime after a crime of this magnitude. But it was a start. A beginning that said that the world must not only remain silent, not only forget, and not only count the dead. It must also ask who was responsible. And it must have the courage to pronounce a verdict. Chapter 13. The Succession Processes. Nuremberg did not end with a verdict in the main war crimes trial. Although the great trial of Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, Frank, Streicher, and the other defendants had made the strongest impression on the world public, it was only able to capture a small part of the National Socialist responsibility. The dock of the first trial showed the top of the regime, but underneath it lay a wide network of men, authorities, offices, professional groups, and institutions, without whom Hitler's rule would never have functioned in this form. The National Socialist state had become criminal not only because of a few leading figures. He had needed doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, diplomats, administrative officials, SS leaders, police officers, military officers, and ministry officials. This is precisely why the main trial was followed by further proceedings, the so-called Nuremberg follow-up trials. They no longer focused only on the top political elite, but on those functional elites who had supported, managed, justified, and implemented the system in practice. These follow-up trials took place between 1946 and 1949 and were conducted by American military courts in Nuremberg. Unlike the main trial, they were no longer supported jointly by all four victorious powers. The increasing tensions between the former Allies, the beginning of the Cold War, and the different interests in Germany made it increasingly difficult to continue the international format. Nevertheless, the follow-up trials remained closely linked to the legacy of the International Military Tribunal. They relied on the legal bases that had been created at Nuremberg and continued the central question: how far does personal responsibility extend in a criminal state? This question was now taken to areas that were less visible than Hitler's inner circle of power, but which had been crucial to the functioning of the regime. One of the best-known follow-up trials was the doctor's trial. He showed in a particularly harrowing way how medical knowledge, state power, and racist ideology could become a deadly alliance. The defendants were doctors and officials who had been involved in human experiments in concentration camps, in killing programs, and in medical crimes. National Socialist medicine had partly distanced itself from its actual mission of healing people and alleviating suffering. Instead, prisoners were turned into experimental material, people with disabilities were considered unworthy of life, and medical authority was used for selection, mutilation, and killing. The trial made it clear that science without ethics can become the servant of violence. It later led to the formulation of important principles for medical research on humans, especially the requirement for voluntary consent. The perpetrators had treated their victims not as patients or human beings, but as objects of a state that presumed to decide on the value of life. Equally important was the lawyer's trial. He met a professional group that was particularly fond of invoking form, procedure, and law. Judges, public prosecutors, and high-ranking judicial officials were accused who had not defended the law under National Socialism, but had turned it into an instrument of persecution. This trial was important because it showed an inconvenient truth. Dictatorships rule not only through open violence, but also through courts, files, judgments, and paragraphs. In the Nazi state, political opponents, Jews, Poles, so-called vermin of the people, and many other people were persecuted by a judiciary that outwardly still pretended to be a legal system. Death sentences, special courts, the People's Court, racist laws, and arbitrary criminal practice made visible how law can become injustice when judges no longer serve justice, but an ideology. The legal process therefore not only put individuals on trial, but the moral responsibility of an entire profession. Another important complex concerned economic and industrial processes. In proceedings against those responsible for large companies such as IG Farben, Flick, and Krupp, it was investigated how closely parts of the German economy were connected with rearmament, forced labor, exploitation, and robbery. These trials showed that war and annihilation were not made possible by party speakers and SS men alone. They needed raw materials, factories, loans, engineering, manpower, and industrial capacity. Companies profited from the elimination of Jewish competition, from the plundering of occupied territories, and from the work of deported people. The defendants often portrayed themselves as entrepreneurs who had acted under state pressure, but the proceedings showed that economic interests and political violence were often intertwined. The pursuit of profit, adaptation, career, and proximity to power formed a dangerous mixture. The question was not only whether someone had personally beaten or killed. The question was also who materially supported a system based on deprivation of rights and exploitation. The follow-up trials against the SS, police, and administration led even deeper into the mechanics of terror. The Einsatzgruppen trial in particular made visible how mass murder was organized in the East. Men who had led mobile murder squads and were responsible for the shooting of hundreds of thousands of people were on trial here. Their defense often referred to orders, the war situation, and alleged necessities. But the evidence showed that these were not normal military actions, but systematic killings of civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The trial made visible the coldness of the perpetrators, who wrote murder reports, reported the number of victims, and presented their actions as compulsory service. This revealed a particularly oppressive form of modern violence, the mass murderer as a recipient of administration and orders, who describes his act not as a personal crime, but as the task of an apparatus. The trial against the Race and Settlement Main Office, as well as other SS offices, also showed how deeply National Socialist ideology intervened in administrative decisions. It was about Germanization, expulsion, abduction of children, population policy, and the violent reorganization of Europe according to racist criteria. These proceedings made it clear that National Socialism not only wanted to destroy, but also to create a new order, an order in which entire populations were to be sorted, expelled, enslaved, or exterminated according to their alleged value. The perpetrators were not always men at the front. Many sat in offices, planned resettlements, drew up lists, signed orders, and turned racist fantasies into concrete measures. This was precisely where the frightening modernity of the system lay. In the military trials, generals and high-ranking officers were at the center of attention. Here, the responsibility of the Wehrmacht was further investigated, especially in connection with the war in the East, the treatment of prisoners of war, hostage shootings, commando orders, and the support of occupation crimes. These proceedings were politically sensitive, because in the post-war period the image of a supposedly clean Wehrmacht that had little to do with the crimes of the SS soon began to form. The succession processes contradicted this simple separation. They showed that military leadership and criminal policies were often linked. Although not every soldier was a perpetrator in the same sense, the idea that the Wehrmacht had only fought honorably and had nothing to do with extermination policy could not be maintained in view of the orders, the cooperation with the SS and police, and the violence against civilians. The significance of the succession processes lay precisely in the fact that they expanded responsibility. After the main trial, there would have been a danger of concentrating the blame on a few prominent names. Hitler, Himmler, Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, and a few others could then have appeared as the sole bearers of evil. However, the follow-up trials showed that a criminal regime not only has a top, but also a body. This body consists of professionals, civil servants, doctors, judges, officers, entrepreneurs, technicians, and administrators. Many of them were not wild fanatics in appearance. Some seemed educated, correct, objective, and conscientious. This is precisely what made the trials so important. They showed that crimes do not always occur in the face of the monster. Sometimes they appear in the language of efficiency, competence, science, economic efficiency, or legal form. But even the succession processes had limits. Not all perpetrators were charged, many escaped, and many later returned to professional or social positions. With the beginning of the Cold War, the political situation shifted. The Western occupying powers began to see West Germany as a future partner against the Soviet Union. As a result, interest in comprehensive prosecution gradually declined. Many sentences were later mitigated, and some convicts were released earlier. For survivors and relatives of the victims, this was often difficult to bear. The impression arose that political expediency was once again becoming stronger than justice. Nuremberg had made a start, but it could not grasp the full breadth of the guilt. Nevertheless, the succession processes remain of great historical importance. They broadened the view of National Socialist crimes and showed that responsibility does not only lie with the highest authorities. They made it clear that doctors cannot hide behind research, judges cannot hide behind laws, entrepreneurs cannot hide behind market constraints, officers cannot hide behind orders, and civil servants cannot hide behind files if their actions become part of a system of violence and dehumanization. This insight extends far beyond the history of National Socialism. It affects every modern society in which power is organized according to the division of labor and guilt can easily hide behind responsibilities. The follow-up trials were therefore Nuremberg's second, deeper look. The main trial had brought the leaders of the regime before the court. The later proceedings showed how many hands had been needed to turn ideology into reality. They explained how a state murders, not only through orders from above, but through the cooperation of many who plan, calculate, judge, research, deliver, transport, administer, and remain silent. This was precisely her enduring warning. A criminal system does not live solely on its leaders. It lives from people who put their skills at its service. Nuremberg showed the faces of power in the main trial. The succession processes showed the tools with which this power worked. Chapter 14. Criticism, Limits, and Political Tensions. The Nuremberg trials are still considered one of the most important turning points in the history of international law. They made it clear that even state leaders, ministers, generals, and high officials are not exempt from responsibility when they plan wars of aggression, deport people, murder civilians, or persecute entire population groups. But precisely because Nuremberg has such great historical significance, its borders must not be concealed. The trial was a milestone, but not a flawless triumph of pure justice. It was an attempt to administer justice after an unprecedented crime, and at the same time a trial that took place in a world of victors, interests, political tensions, and imperfect standards. Anyone who wants to understand Nuremberg must therefore see both its moral power and its contradictions. Even then, the most common accusation was victor's justice. The judges and prosecutors came from the states that had won the war. Only representatives of the defeated German Reich were accused. Crimes or problematic actions of the Allies were not investigated in the same way. This objection was not simply plucked out of thin air. In fact, the victorious powers sat in judgment over the vanquished, and they themselves determined which acts were tried and which were not. The bombing of German cities, the expulsion of large groups of the German population after the war, Soviet acts of violence, or the Katyn massacre were not treated as allied questions of guilt before the Nuremberg tribunal. Katyn was particularly explosive because the Soviet side tried to shift responsibility for this crime to Germany, although it later became clear that the Soviet Secret Service was responsible for the murder of thousands of Polish officers. Such points show that Nuremberg was not outside power politics. But the reference to Victor's justice does not explain everything. It cannot erase the real crimes of the National Socialist regime. The fact that not all the crimes of the war were tried does not mean that the crimes tried did not take place or were not punishable. War of aggression, extermination of Jews, mass shootings, forced labor, hostage killings, mistreatment of prisoners of war and terror in the occupied territories were comprehensively documented by documents, witnesses, orders, and confessions. The criticism of the one-sidedness of the court touches on the question of completeness, not the truth of the evidence. Nuremberg was therefore both limited and necessary. It was not a world court for all guilt of the Second World War, but a court for the main responsible persons of the defeated Nazi state. Another criticism concerned the legal basis. In particular, the accusation of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity was described by defense attorneys and later critics as retrospective law. The court was accused of using terms that would not have clearly existed as criminal offenses in this form before the London Statute. According to classical legal thinking, no one may be punished for an act that was not punishable at the time it was committed. This objection was serious, because a court that applies new law retroactively is operating in a dangerous area. The prosecution and the judges replied that the accused acts were not really legally neutral. Wars of aggression had already been outlawed by international treaties and political obligations, and murder, deportation, mistreatment of prisoners of war or terror against civilians were not simply permitted even under earlier legal principles. In addition, Nuremberg asked a fundamental question: can a state make everything lawful through its own laws and orders, even mass murder? The court's answer was no. This answer was historically significant, but it did not solve all legal difficulties. Nuremberg moved between the old and the new law. It drew on existing standards, but developed them further. This is exactly where his dual role lies. From the point of view of the perpetrators and defense attorneys, this could seem like an afterthought. From the point of view of the victims and many lawyers, it was a necessary further development of the law in the face of a crime that went beyond the previous categories. The law had to react to a new reality, to a modern state that had put its administration, its army, its police, its science, its propaganda, and its economy at the service of war and annihilation. If the law had only responded to this with old terms, a large part of the guilt would have remained invisible. Nuremberg was also politically tense from the beginning. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had been allies in the war, but their common front began to crumble after 1945. The ideological contradictions between Western democracies and Soviet communism became increasingly apparent. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union expanded its influence, while the Western allies increasingly thought about a different future for Germany. This incipient bloc formation also had an effect on the processes. They still worked together in Nuremberg, but mistrust grew. There have always been political interests behind legal issues. The Soviet Union wanted to highlight the German crimes in the East with the greatest possible severity, but to exclude Soviet crimes. The Western powers wanted to create a credible legal process, but also an order in which Germany would not remain permanently in chaos. Nuremberg thus became one of the last major joint projects of the War Alliance before the Cold War divided the world. The selection of the defendants also showed limits. Many of the main perpetrators were dead, including Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels. Others had fled or were only caught later. Some perpetrators escaped altogether. The main trial was only able to negotiate a limited number of people and had to represent the most important areas of the regime. This inevitably created a gap between the scale of the crimes and the number of defendants. Millions of people were affected by National Socialist rule at some point, but only a few were in the dock in Nuremberg. Even the succession processes could not close this gap. Many officials, judges, entrepreneurs, police officers, soldiers, camp officials and informers were never held accountable or later received mild sentences. For many victims, this was difficult to bear. A particularly problematic point was the later political development. In the first post-war years, the punishment of National Socialist perpetrators was very much in the foreground. But with the beginning of the Cold War, priorities changed. West Germany became increasingly important to the Western powers as a partner against the Soviet Union. Experts, administrative officials, lawyers, military personnel and scientists were needed again. In this climate, the will for comprehensive prosecution decreased. Many convicts received reduced sentences, were released earlier or later found social positions again. In Germany itself, too, a need for repression, self-relief and reconstruction prevailed for a long time. The big question of guilt was often overshadowed by the question of one's own suffering. Nuremberg had created evidence, but it could not force a society to deal honestly with them immediately. The German perception of the trial was also divided. Part of the population saw Nuremberg as a necessary reckoning with the Nazi leadership. Others saw the proceedings as humiliation by the victors. Many, on the other hand, only noticed it from a distance, because everyday life was characterized by hunger, housing shortages, returnees, refugees, and rubble work. This distance was important. While the world public saw Nuremberg as a historic moment, many Germans were simply fighting for their survival. This did not mean that they were innocent or could not have known anything. But it explains why Nuremberg's moral message did not immediately reach everywhere. The confrontation with the crimes of National Socialism lasted decades and often took place against resistance. Another limit lay in the difficulty of determining individual guilt in a system based on the division of labor. Modern crimes are rarely committed by a single hand. One drafts laws, another signs orders, the third organizes transports, the fourth guards camps, the fifth hires workers, the sixth writes propaganda, the seventh profits from stolen property. Nuremberg had to decide who was criminally responsible and who was morally charged, but legally difficult to grasp. This distinction was necessary, but it led to tensions. Many people had the feeling that the judiciary could not do justice to the breadth of guilt. A court can examine specific acts, orders, and jurisdictions, but it cannot condemn the entire moral entanglement of a society. Despite all this criticism, Nuremberg's importance remains enormous. It is precisely its limits that make it not worthless, but historically understandable. It was a trial in a destroyed world, supported by victorious powers with their own interests, dependent on new legal concepts and burdened by political contradictions. But at the same time, it was an attempt not to simply take revenge. The defendants were given defense lawyers, the court examined evidence, it did not find everyone guilty, and it left behind documentation that is still invaluable today. Nuremberg proved that the law does not have to be completely silenced even after extreme violence. Perhaps the most important lesson lies precisely in this imperfection. Justice after a breach of civilization is never pure, simple, or complete. It is always overshadowed by political power, human limitation, and historical wounds. But the alternative would have been silence, forgetting, or mere retaliation. Nuremberg decided to take a different path. The trial was not free of contradictions, but it forced the world to name responsibility. He showed that crimes remain crimes even if they are committed by states, covered up by orders or organized by powerful men. Its limitations remind us to remain vigilant against power. His achievement reminds us that justice must begin even where it comes too late to save the victims, but early enough to hold on to the truth. Chapter 15. Nuremberg's Heritage. Before Nuremberg, it was by no means a matter of course that state leaders, ministers, generals, or high officials could be personally brought before an international court for war and mass crimes. States have long been regarded as the central actors of international law. When a war ended, borders were changed, treaties were concluded, reparations demanded, or governments were overthrown. but the responsibility of individual decision-makers often remained in the background. Nuremberg changed this perspective. In essence, the trial said, not only states act, but people. Non-abstract entities plan wars of aggression, sign orders, organize deportations or order shootings. They are concrete people who make decisions, exercise power and bear responsibility. This idea became a cornerstone of modern international criminal law. Particularly consequential was the idea that the reference to orders does not automatically exempt from guilt. In hierarchical systems, obedience is often a central principle. Armies, ministries, police authorities, and administrations function via chains of command. But Nuremberg made it clear that obedience has limits. Those who are involved in murder, deportation, torture, forced labor, or extermination cannot completely hide behind the instructions of a superior. This did not mean that every ordinary subordinate was responsible in the same way as a leading perpetrator. But it meant that man remains a moral and legal subject even in a chain of command. This insight was particularly important because the National Socialist system had tried to dissolve responsibility into responsibilities, orders, and administrative channels. The concept of crimes against humanity was also permanently coined by Nuremberg. He gave the law a language for acts that do not only affect individual victims or states, but attack the foundations of human dignity. Murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and systematic persecution could now be understood as crimes that had significance beyond national borders. This set an important barrier against state arbitrariness. No regime should be able to claim that its crimes are internal affairs. When a state disenfranchises, persecutes, and exterminates people on the basis of their origin, religion, political conviction, or supposed race, then this does not only affect the state. It affects humanity as a whole. Human dignity, equality before the law, the prohibition of arbitrary arrest, protection from torture, and the right to a fair trial took on a new urgency after 1945. Later international criminal courts were also overshadowed by Nuremberg. When international tribunals were created in the 1990s after the wars in the former Yugoslavia and after the genocide in Rwanda, the Nuremberg experience was deliberately used. Again, the question was whether political and military leaders can be held responsible for mass violence. Again, courts had to gather evidence, investigate lines of command, hear witnesses, and determine individual guilt in the midst of collective violence. Later, the International Criminal Court was created, which continued the idea that the most serious crimes such as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and war of aggression should not go unpunished. Even though this court is politically controversial and not all states recognize it, its existence shows how strongly the legacy of Nuremberg continues to have an effect. But Nuremberg did not only leave behind legal terms. It also left behind a historical method. The trial showed how important documentation is. The prosecutors collected files, films, photos, reports, and witness statements. They made it visible that memory consists not only of personal impressions, but also of evidence that must be examined, sorted, and made publicly available. Especially in view of later denial, trivialization, and distortion, this was invaluable. Nuremberg created an archive of responsibility. It showed that the perpetrators could be convicted not only by moral judgments, but by their own documents, orders, and words. This makes the trial one of the most important sources for understanding the National Socialist system of rule to this day. For Germany, the legacy of Nuremberg was ambivalent for a long time. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many Germans viewed the trial with distance, rejection, or indifference. Some saw it as a necessary punishment of the leadership, others saw it as a humiliation by the victors. Many were preoccupied with hunger, housing shortages, flight, homecoming, and reconstruction, and did not want to deal with their own past. It was only over years and decades that Nuremberg became part of the German culture of remembrance. The trials contributed to the fact that the crimes of National Socialism could not be completely suppressed. They provided evidence, names, structures, and terms. Nevertheless, it took a long time for larger parts of society to be willing to talk not only about Hitler and the top leadership, but also about participation, looking the other way, profiting and remaining silent. The legacy of Nuremberg, therefore, also consists of a warning against convenient shifting of guilt. A criminal system does not live only from a dictator. It lives from people who write orders, plan transports, formulate laws, pronounce judgments, spread propaganda, run factories, process files, and convince themselves that they are only responsible for their small area. Nuremberg showed how dangerous this attitude is. Modern violence is often based on the division of labor. This is precisely why everyone involved can be tempted to downplay their responsibility. The trial countered this evasion with a simple but uncomfortable truth: even those who do not act alone still act. Even those who are part of an apparatus remain responsible for what they support, enable, or deliberately ignore. At the same time, Nuremberg shows that justice after a crime against humanity always remains imperfect. No verdict could bring back the murdered. No trial could heal the suffering of the survivors. Many perpetrators were never punished. Many punishments later seemed too lenient. Many responsible people found ways back to a normal life. The international criminal justice system after Nuremberg also remained dependent on power relations. Not every perpetrator in the world is prosecuted. Not every state recognizes international courts. Not every great power is willing to be controlled. This is a bitter reality. But that is precisely why Nuremberg remains important. It does not show that law always wins. Perhaps the deepest significance of Nuremberg lies in the connection between remembrance and responsibility. The trial forced the world to look. He made it clear that history is not only about victories, defeats, and great men, but also about moral decisions. He asked what people do when power allows them to disenfranchise others. He asked what becomes of law when it submits to an ideology. He asked how propaganda creates hatred, how administration organizes murder, and how obedience can become an excuse. These questions are not limited to the year 1945. They remain relevant as long as states wage war, persecute minorities, manipulate truth, and people try to hide responsibility behind orders. So Nuremberg was not the end of history, but a beginning. It was the beginning of a new way of thinking about international responsibility. It was the beginning of a legal language for crimes that had previously often been dismissed as consequences of war or internal state affairs. It was the beginning of a memory that is based on evidence and understands perpetrators not only as monsters, but as acting people in concrete structures. This is precisely why Nuremberg remains uncomfortable. It does not allow us to lock guilt into the past and pretend that it only concerns a distant, foreign world. It reminds us that law, humanity, and truth must always be defended. In the end, Nuremberg stands for a hope that was born from rubble. After war, genocide, and moral collapse, the world tried to find an answer that was more than revenge. This response was incomplete, politically charged, and humanly limited, but it was nevertheless of historic magnitude. She said, "Even the powerful can be guilty. States can also commit crimes. Orders also have limits. Even victims who have been deprived of everything are entitled to have their suffering not concealed." This is the lasting legacy of Nuremberg. It is not a simple success story, but a serious commitment. The obligation to look, to remember, and not to demand responsibility only when it is long too late.